All right, everybody, welcome to Theory Underground. This is week 2 of the special sort of break in the midst of CMT and CDT, the Snellgrove-McKerracher synthesis seminar series that has been going on for the last year and a half here at Theory Underground. A couple of things I'm going to say before diving into it. First of all, obviously, taking this break from the Snellgrove-McKerracher synthesis has been this opportunity for Mikey and I to collaborate and to sort of take everything that has been going on in the background and sort of like roll out a welcome mat of sorts for everybody in terms of where this is going and how we're thinking about approaching everything at Theory Underground. This is not being live streamed publicly right now, but it will be premiered on Wednesday. So in 3 days, you'll all be on the channel there. And this is kind of part 2, like I was just saying, week 2, but at the same time, it's also sort of the culmination of the whole last 6 months. So critical media theory and critical doxology and time energy and the way that they both come together in thinking about the social unconscious is where it got us last time with the big other versus the superego. And I was doing more with habitus and field, the elusio that makes a field meaningful, that brings stakes to the game that we're playing in any field, and the particular kind of libido that hooks into that elusio. It's on the channel, it's public, and everybody should be able to go watch it on their own. But these are not always public. These seminar sessions are often never released to the public, but they will be in some form or another at some point in the distant future. And I wanted to announce, even though he's not here right now, that Will is almost finished with the collation of transcriptions of all of the CMT and CDT seminar sessions from this year into a set of documents that I am then typesetting into a book. And then Ann and I will both, and then Mikey as well, have an opportunity to add some additional supportive quotes. We'll have a chance to make it a little bit more readable, a little bit, because it's a lecture format. So we'll make some adjustments, and then we'll be able to roll out an actual volume of the research seminar here at Theory Underground. And it will be everybody's who's been a part of this, as well as the broader public who might be interested in such things, sort of like an invitation to contribute to the conversation, to take certain research questions, texts, concepts, thinkers to task or elaborate on various aspects of the project. And so, like I said, even though he's not here, let's give it up for Will, because that's such a cool thing that he's doing. It's something that I've wanted to do. It's something that I've thought about, but I never actually, obviously I don't have the time and energy for it. And it's just like one of the coolest things. And he said it's just doing it has been invaluable for his own learning, because, he watched the lectures, and that's one thing, but transcribing them and sitting there reading over everything, it's different. And I was reading to Anne some of the quotes from the transcriptions, and I was like, doesn't it sound better? Like once our voices are kind of removed from it, because we hate our own voices sometimes, right? Like, it's like, oh, that's cool. Like, so it makes it easier for me to go back over what's been said, because I don't really like going back over these lecture sessions very often. It feels weird and narcissistic for some reason. Like, and it's like, oh, it's my voice. Ew. I don't know. I think a lot of people can probably relate to that experience. So that's
This bar
exciting.
is made with organic oats. You're made for the climb. The
What is
most
that?
important ingredient is you.
What is that? What the hell was that? Did everybody else hear that? Okay. Organic oats. Right on. All right. So with that, I'm going to set Mikey up. He's going to go first this week, and then I'll be going. This week, we're talking about the plurality of big others, the big other as a Russian doll. And the concrete other. The concrete other by way of Levinas, and the big other by way of Lacan and Žižek. And ultimately, this is a way of thinking about, in part, the difference between what it is that we are doing in the underground and what academics are doing in the institutions. Writing in the institutions is increasingly machinic. It's increasingly generic. It's hyper specialized and fine-tuned to a niche audience of people who are probably reading you so they can cite you for the sake of social capital, so that they can get into a journal, right? Now, it's kind of gross. I think everyone would agree. This idea of doing scientific or philosophical research where you pay a journal to let you publish, and that's the main way of entry, right? But in a sort of sense, that's already what's going on with academic journals, because you're paying by reading all the other people in it to make it like they matter. Now, of course, this is inevitable, and also it's not something that we can use to totalize or reduce all the accomplishments actually being done within the institutions. But for those of us who don't like the prospect of, just so that we can join a conversation, spending 10 years forcing ourselves to focus on things that we're not actually interested in, for those of us who aren't interested in reading a lot of people just to cite them, just so that we can actually be a part of a conversation that is ultimately about a career and not really about our own interests, we want to do something else. And that's kind of what we're trying to figure out here at Theory Underground with Theory Writing 101, the course that just came to its conclusion. We're trying to figure out, what is the genre of underground theory writing? What is this thing that we're doing? What are the advantages of doing it outside of the institution? And what are the disadvantages? Because there's definitely disadvantages. Being in the attention economy comes with tremendous disadvantages that, if a scholar actually has achieved some degree of otium or scholae, of actual leisure time, they are able to be free of these pressures to memify everything and pursue this, staying relevant in the eyes of the algorithms, right? But at the same time, there are huge disadvantages. And one of those disadvantages is, like I said, doing stuff that you're not actually genuinely interested in, right? Like, this is, maybe Mikey will even touch on this, but like, the big other tells us that if you want to have any authority, or if you want to have the right to your scholae and be able to actually research things, then you actually have to give up your inherent interests for anywhere between 10 and 20 years to succeed from high school to postdoc. That requires forcing yourself to say, okay, I am really interested in reading X, Y, or Z right now, but instead I'm going to go grind on A, B, or C for the sake of this diploma or this degree. Of course, there's also something amazing about the structuring of your time and the assumption that it's okay that you do what you do, right, within the academic institution. What's up, Ian?
No, just a quick comment on the academia field. I don't know if you guys know Sabine Hossenfelder. She's like a physicist, and she mentions this, like, she has been struggling a lot with the research that she wants to do, and basically because there is no funding, right? So also the funding, it's a huge limit on what you should focus your interests. And it's predetermined before you even enter the field, just like the economics of it.
Yeah, and who's it determined by, right? The book Disciplined Minds by, I think his name is Jeff Schmidt, is about how the professional is basically broken on the wheel, not just of production for the sake of capital, but also for the research that is directed by the interests of the military industrial complex, and how most of what gets called the hardest sciences is being funded by that machine, but it is kind of like laundered through these other institutions and nonprofits. The source of that funding is from the state, and it's for the weapons manufacturing or whatever. But but if a scientist is just looking at where's the funding coming from, in a lot of cases they just find some nonprofit with like a beautiful mission, and they're like, ah, that's great. And so Jeff Schmidt, like, he's like, oh, but like, let's go a level deeper. Where are they getting their money from? And it's a fantastic book. Disciplined Minds will actually be a really important part of what I'm doing with the Revolution Will Not Be series on the channel. And for anyone who's not familiar with that, I think it's 4 episodes in so far, and it's me reading essential chapters from books that have been fundamental for me leaving my old set of activist assumptions. Okay, but with that said, I want to get to it. The big other, sacrificing your own interests to the academic big other, blah, blah, blah. Obviously, these ideal types between concrete other and big other, as well as between academic institution and underground theory writing. These ideal types are a way of thinking about a situation. They are heuristics. They're not ontologically mutually exclusive. It's nothing like that. This is just a basic way of rendering intelligible the situation that we find ourselves in. Okay. Now, with that said, I'm going to turn it over here to Mikey, and then we'll bring it back. And I just have to say, like, the last thing is that after this basically 2.5 to 3 hour session that we're doing here, I'm going to take a quick little break and then come back and record a special session that kicks off the Totality Infinity course, and it will be directly related to what I did in my lecture today. And so for those of you who have time, who are interested in being here for the whole thing, you're welcome to be here for the whole thing. But also, if you're not, it is recorded and will be made available to you afterwards. Cool.
Okay, so today we're gonna keep talking about big other. We're gonna talk more about superego, and again, I think it's important to frame this as we are talking about the social unconscious. That these are dynamics that most people aren't explicitly aware of the functioning, right? They're not aware of how these dynamics are functioning, and thus it's part of the social unconscious. And so just getting tapped in to how some of these dynamics work really changes how you view society as a whole. And so the thing is, though, this friction between big other and superego, again, we've already established that the superego and the big other, they operate in a kind of collusion with one another, where they would both disavow it, right? The big other would say, I uphold the law and I'm about good, proper behavior and none of that wild excess over here. And superego would say, fuck you, I'm rebellious, I do what I want, I'm free, I'm not imprisoned by your social mandates. And yet it's a Mobius strip, right? That if you theoretically investigate the big other, you're going to find that at some point you've crossed over into the superego, and vice versa. You follow the path of the superego, you find out that you're on the same surface of the big other, right? So this Mobius strip, or non-orientable status of these two, is crucial to understand if you want to understand the law or society or any symbolic order, right? And so different philosophers, different theorists throughout the years have approached this dynamic, and it is a kind of dualism. It's just to view it as dualistic, that you have these two different authority, these virtual authorities, big other, superego. To view it as a pure dualism is to be caught up in the ideology of it, because the point is it's not really a dualism, right? But nonetheless, we have to think the two, just like with the Mobius strip, right? it's all one surface, but you can't deny that there is a cut where if you limit the strip, you do see two surfaces, right? You do see a bottom and a top. So you have to keep the two while also simultaneously realizing that it's a one, right? But okay, so some of the theorists that have gotten to this friction between these two sides of the social order, obviously Nietzsche, with the birth of tragedy, the Apollonian and the Dionysian. The Apollonian's about order and structure, right? So that's big other. The Dionysian is about these wild rituals and excess and blah blah blah. Well, that's the superego. And the point is, they're not completely at odds with each other. They help reinforce each other. So Bataille also thinks this distinction, he would call it work versus sacrifice, right? Work has to do with the everyday structure and protocols of our daily lives that help us reproduce the economy, etc. But then there's also the acts of sacrifice, the rituals, etc. That give us outlets, that give us forms of excess, jouissance, etc. Baudrillard would end up talking about this. It's a little bit more nuanced with him. Like, to really do this justice, we have to go into Baudrillard, but I just think it's worth mentioning in passing his distinction between value and symbolic exchange, right? This one, again, like I say, it would need to be clarified, but roughly speaking, that distinction works there. Then Lacan, right? He worked out this distinction between pleasure and jouissance. Same thing, right? Pleasure is the pleasure principle. It's homeostasis. It stabilizes the social order, etc. Jouissance is what must be expelled from the social order, at least from the official perspective, right? Of course, it operates in the background as superegoic enjoyment. But and then Žižek, like I say, I think it's important again to restate this. Obviously, we know Freud invented the concept of the superego, and then Lacan's the one who came along and said, well, the superego is what really commands us to enjoy. But nobody has really made this distinction better than Žižek when it comes to big other versus superego. And so I think it's important to really kind of give him the most credit for this this distinction, because I think he has the best understanding of it in all its complexity. Then it might be odd for me to bring this guy in, but it's worth pointing out. So Jordan Peterson, right? He at least at one point, I don't know if he mentions it much anymore, but as a Jungian and on that that side of theory, he always wanted to talk about, and he's into Jung, he's into myth studies, all that. So this distinction between order and chaos was big for him, right? And actually, I found a quote of his that I think is worth reading, because I think it helps us better contextualize this distinction between big other and superego. So he says, hey, this is from 12 Rules of Life, page 44. Chaos and order are fundamental elements because every lived situation, even every conceivable lived situation, is made up of both. Okay, that's good, right? He's okay. No matter where we are, there are some things we can identify, make use of, and predict, and some things we neither know nor understand. No matter who we are, Kahali desert dweller or Wall Street banker, some things are under our control and some things are not. That's why both can understand the same stories and dwell within the confines of the same eternal truths. Finally, the fundamental reality of chaos and order is true for everything alive, not only for us. Living things are always to be found in places that they can master, surrounded by things and situations that make them vulnerable. Order is not enough. You can't just be stable and secure and unchanging, because there are still vital and important new things to be learned. Nonetheless, chaos can be too much. You can't long tolerate being swamped and overwhelmed beyond your capacity to cope while you are learning what you still need to know. Thus, you need to place one foot in what you have mastered and understood, and the other in what you are currently exploring and mastering. Then you have positioned yourself where the terror of existence is under control and you are secure. But where are you? But where you are also alert and engaged. That is where there is something new to master and some way that you can be improved. That is where meaning is to be found. Okay, so there's a lot of ways to critique that, but there's also a lot of things. I mean, he's getting at something that's just kind of a blatant truth, right? That we're always stuck between stability and, or to talk like DNG, he's kind of talking about territorialization versus deterritorialization and then reterritorialization. That we're caught up in this friction between stability and disorder, right? Order and disorder. And in a lot of ways, we can just go, well, that's just pleasure, pleasure versus jouissance, right? But the only thing, and he kind of gets at it in part, right? Where he's like, okay, chaos can be too much, order is not enough. But what this dualistic picture fails to understand is ordered chaos, right? And what I mean by that is it's this third category that is how the superego functions, right? The superego is that point in the social unconscious that gives us excess, gives us jouissance, right? Gives us destabilization, but in a way that secretly is keeping us hooked onto the existing order of things, right? This is the trick of at work in ideology for Žižek, right? Is that ideology functions not just at the level of meaning, not just at the level because look how he ends the quote. That is where meaning is to be found, right? The issue is that Peterson acts like everything's about meaning, finding significance. And the social unconscious, while providing meaning, obviously, the big other is the symbolic order, right? It's the other that provides us with a network of meaning. What really keeps us anchored to it, what glues us to it, is this other thing called jouissance, right? And so while obviously just on a kind of superficial level, there's some advice worth taking into account from Peterson on that quote, the dualism of it is misleading, right? And in fact, like to think order and chaos in these dualistic terms, you could say is ideological on Peterson's part. But so yeah, like what Peterson's position doesn't understand is how modes of chaos structurally reproduce order. That is, he doesn't see the chaos at the heart of order itself. For Žižek, what keeps us hooked on order, glued to order, is chaos itself, or jouissance, right? So the trick is when it comes to thinking about this chaos in this what is unmastered, you could even say the real, right? It works out well. I mean, what Peterson's calling order is similar to just our imaginary symbolic reality, whereas this thing that destabilizes it, breaks it apart, always is a threat to it, is the Lacanian real. But what his discussion of chaos doesn't seem to get at is a distinction within chaos itself, right? So the real distinction is ordered chaos versus disordered chaos. So ordered chaos would be superego, right? For the reasons we've already talked. The disordered chaos would just be death drive itself in its pure form, which is this push to go to zero, right? To break everything apart and start again. And so there's a friction here, even at the unconscious social level, of ordered jouissance, which is superego, and drive. And you can, part of the trick is like the ideology of inherent transgression, right? What superego does is it's like, if I can get them convinced that they're enjoying and they're free, or if I, even if it's not just a pure trick, if I can give them some outlet for enjoyment, then that will shield the big other, that will shield the symbolic order from a true, like, revolutionary explosion of drive that would just bring everything crashing down to zero, right? So I think it's important here to, when we think about this stuff, to keep this distinction between ordered chaos and disordered chaos in mind, which is again superego versus drive. Now, this whole side of this, the social unconscious between these, you know, between order and law and rules and prohibitions, and then these outlets of jouissance, right? Bataille has a lot to say about this stuff, and Bataille is very, very much aware of how jouissance basically is at play in the social field. Now, Bataille is going to talk about, you know, and anybody who's into Bataille, you're going to hear him talk about what is called limit experiences. Now, here's the thing, right? So, limit experiences, as you can guess, right? It's kind of playing off of Kant's idea of the concept of the noumenon. So, in Kant, right, you have your mental apparatus. It has certain active principles that it applies to raw sense data, and those active constructive principles build the world we experience in the senses that is coherent and regular and subject to law, etc. Right? It's the world that makes sense and is ordered, right? Well, for Kant, the question is, and this is still a question philosophers argue about when it comes to Kant, is the noumenon, the concept of the thing in itself, is it an empty concept? Which is to say, well, all it does is it keeps us from trying to apply our mental criteria beyond their parameters, right? The idea of the thing in itself would tell us, like, okay, there's a thing out there, but we can't know it because we are actively structuring experience. But then the question is, well, but is there really a positive thing out there outside of us, or is it just a limit within our own mental apparatus, right? Considering it as a limit concept, all the noumenon would be is the concept that limits the range of experience, right? Or the range of conceptualization. Well, okay, so that would be a limit concept, but what's the difference between a limit concept and a limit experience? Well, okay, the concept of noumenon as a limit concept, it's a limit on our intellectual faculty, right? Not so much on our sensorium, on our sensibility. It's a cognitive limit, right? For Bataille, though, there's experiences we can have that so overload our body, overload our sensorium, that it's basically the experience of experience itself breaking down, reaching its limit. So the thought of the noumenon is not necessarily, you know, an intensive experience, right? It's just it's an abstraction. Whereas a limit experience is something that's incredibly intense, to the point of breaking down your very sense of self, breaking down your body, etc. And so, I mean, a limit experience, I mean, it would be all of the main taboos and things that we prohibit: torture, incest, cannibalism, orgies, necrophilia, shit eating, rape, murder, like all what we would all consider the worst, or at least the most taboo of activities. And so Bataille basically is acting like, when we're talking about this distinction between order and chaos, or between work and sacrifice, to use his terms, he wants to say that sacrifice is always connected to religion, and religion's always rooted in these sensual rituals. Right now, for anybody in the Christian world, he makes it clear, like, and he's echoing Nietzsche here, like, Christianity really went out of its way to separate sensuality from religion, right? It's a desexualized religion. And but throughout history, religions have always had rituals or feasts or whatever that were baked into them, that were these moments of excess, right? And so, you know, you connect sensuality to the sacred through the ritual, right? And so it's not that the worst of the worst types of behaviors are part of these religious rituals, but it's the Dionysian impulse, right? It's that religion gave these allotted feasts, these allotted uh, procedures, a place for that impulse to have its moment, right? Um, but the thing is with Bataille, when you start thinking about like, okay, so he's thinking about these extreme experiences that almost just completely break down the psyche, break down the body, etc. Is that what jouissance is, right? Because that's what it gets you thinking about. It gets you thinking like, oh, well, jouissance is just this thing that's completely connected to the most extreme acts of violence or orgiastic explosion. And I mean, look, on the one hand, Lacan is inspired by Bataille in how he thought about jouissance. The first seminar that really focuses on jouissance is Seminar 7. And this is when Lacan is really enamored with Bataille's work. And it's him at his most Bataillean, right? Now, he's going to go on and it's going to get, you know, jouissance is less Bataillean. But at this moment, he's thinking along these lines. And his example of somebody who is basically caught up in the ethics of psychoanalysis, the ethics of desire, who doesn't give ground relative to their desire, is Antigone. And Antigone basically refuses to let her brother rot. Her brother's a soldier, blah, blah, blah. He betrayed the king. He fought for the other side, blah, blah. Okay. But the point of the matter is, Antigone's telling the king, hey, my brother deserves a proper burial. He says, I'm not going to do it. And she's not fucking having it. And it leads to her eventual death. But she just doubles down. It's an absolute, it's like her death drive is a stubborn law unto itself. Like, no matter the consequences, it has to be fulfilled. And so, again, in this moment, this example of jouissance, it's an extreme act of, you know, actually sacrificing yourself for the demand at the heart of your drive, right? And so, okay, that's fine. I understand why we want to, you know, maybe talk about jouissance in relation to these extreme cases, right? um because they're the ones that they're the ones in our fantasy space. They're the ones that we think about as these acts that are, we're always like, what, think about how like Netflix, it can just keep pumping out documentaries on serial killers. Like, it's not that we like identify with serial killers or we like them, but we're drawn to hear about these extreme acts, right? And there's something sublime in you know, in a kind of vulgar sense, right? In sublimity in a vulgar sense, but they captivate our imaginations. They can't captivate our fantasy spaces, and we're drawn to hear about that, right? Um, think about like the mass shooters don't captivate, you know, on this level. Like Netflix isn't going to release a whole bunch of documentaries on the different people who've done mass shootings. We don't remember their names unless you're like a real political junkie and keep up with it. Nobody knows their name. Everybody knows who Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer and Richard Ramirez are, right? So um, this is why there's this tendency to associate jouissance, right, with uh, extreme acts or extreme acts of BDSM or orgies or shit eating or perversion or whatever, right? But and you know, one of the great examples that I in theory tube, a couple years back, Cuck Philosophy, Jonas Cheka, did a video on Bataille, and he used the example of the Hellraiser movies. I don't know if you guys, if everybody's familiar with the Hellraiser films, but basically you have these creatures that come from hell or some in between space of hell and heaven, right? They're called Cenobites. And the famous one is Pinhead. They're all dressed up in leather. They look like it's like dominatrix clothing and all this. And they show up, and it's not just like Freddy Krueger or Jason Voorhees. They basically offer you your most violent delights, right? Like they torture you, but in a way that you can see after a certain point that the victim somehow finds it pleasurable or whatever. So part of it is like this enjoyment in your own destruction, right? The most extreme form of masochism. So again, the reason Cuck philosophy used that example of Hellraiser is because it's a Bataillean limited experience. And Bataille himself. So his famous example of this is Lin Shi, or Death by a Thousand Cuts, right? So at some point, Bataille tells he gives this account in Tears of Eros, and I think he does it somewhere else too. He talks about being given these photos of this Chinese torture victim. And I've got the quote here. It's on pages 205 to 207. It's a long quote because he's just basically describing how he got the photos and blah, blah, blah. And he connects it to Marquis de Sade. And okay, but the point is, when he looked at this photo of this guy, and the guy basically had his chest sliced off, because death by a thousand cuts. So they just keep cutting you and cutting you and cutting you, right? The strange thing is, after the guy had been cut horribly, he has this look of bliss on his face. Like it's like he's made contact with the divine. And this really resonated with Bataille. And he's like, there's this weird kind of, you cross the point of pain, right? Obviously, when this begins, you're just in excruciating pain. But after you cross another threshold, it's like you're in a sublime enjoyment you couldn't even imagine. And so that's the way Bataille says it here in the Tears of Eros. He says, "What I suddenly saw, what imprisoned me in anguish, but which at the same time delivered me from it, was the identity of those perfect contraries, divine ecstasy and its opposite, extreme horror." So in this torture victim's face, he sees this combination of divine ecstasy and extreme horror, right? Now, for you guys who know the CCRU stuff, this is going to influence land, because land, how do you access the noumenon, the fanged noumenon? Well, the point is, it's like you follow your death drive to the point of having a limit experience. And so for the CCRU, it's blaring jungle music and doing copious amounts of speed and self-inducing insomnia and summoning demon lemurs and basically driving yourself mad, right? Because this is what is called a death or artificial death or unlife, right? They're pursuing like the whole CCRU is basically organized around this pursuit of a kind of limit experience where your humanity, your sense of your conceptual apparatus and your sensory parameters all begin to break down, and it's the closest thing that you can come to experiencing death without actually being dead, right? It's the closest you get to having a moment of divine ecstasy mixed with extreme horror. And so that's what the occult practices of the CCRU were geared towards. Okay, so part of it is, all of these extreme acts that we consider limited experiences in one way, shape, or another. It's because for us, phantasmatically, and Bruce Fink summarizes it better than anybody. He just says prohibition eroticizes, right? And this is this Lacan, this Bataille, who really put the emphasis on prohibition, and that whatever is prohibited is what really excites us, what really causes us to desire, etc. Okay, so the things that are the most prohibited are the ones that would seem to cause us to desire the most, right? That would be the logic of it. So Lacan says in Seminar 7, we are, in fact, led to the point where we accept the formula that without transgression, there is no access to jouissance. And to return to St. Paul, that is precisely the function of the law. The point of the law is to give us access to jouissance by making something prohibited, right? Transgression in the direction of jouissance only takes place if it is supported by the oppositional principle, by the forms of the law. If the paths to jouissance have something in them that dies out, that tends to make them impassable, prohibition, if I may say so, becomes its all-terrain vehicle, its half-track truck that gets it out of the circuitous routes that lead man in a roundabout way toward the rut of a short and well-trodden satisfaction. His whole point is, if you're stuck in a rut in your life, you kind of feel libidinally, unstimulated, something being prohibited to you is what it's your half-track truck. It's your four-wheeler. It's what gets you over the terrain of dissatisfaction, right? It ignites your passion, it ignites your desire. And so that's why this Lacan is putting this emphasis on prohibition for that reason, right? Okay, so and then Lacan, you got to realize, like, okay, so he's not gonna just stay stuck in this Bataillean mode forever, but even later on in Seminar 20, he's going to tap back into it. And so there's a lot of Lacanians that'll tell you, like, if you really like Seminar 7, Seminar 20 is going to resonate with you a lot too, because that's where he starts to develop this idea of feminine jouissance, right? Feminine enjoyment. And it's very close to the type of the picture of jouissance he was working with in his Bataille mode. So in Seminar 20, where he's describing feminine jouissance, he uses this example. I mean, you can Google it right now if you want. There's a statue by Bernini, and it's basically the statue of the ecstasy of Saint Teresa. And the way Lacan says of this statue, and if you look at it, it looks like she's coming, she's having an orgasm, right? And it's an incredible statue. It's I mean, the artistry of it is amazing. But this is what Lacan says: you need but go to Rome and see the statue by Bernini to immediately understand that she's coming. There's no doubt about it. What is she getting off on? It is clear that the essential testimony of the mystics consists in saying that they experience it, but know nothing about it. These mystical ejaculations are neither idle chatter nor empty verbiage. They provide, all in all, some of the best reading one can find. So he's saying that feminine jouissance, because it's non-all, that's a whole nother story, but he's saying that this type of jouissance is what the mystics were talking about. They would have some sort of experience, but they can't tell you about it. This is right in line with land and artificial death and the breakdown of experience, right? Land wasn't trying to know phenomena, or know noumena. He was trying to have a kind of dark mystical encounter with them, right? And so okay, all in all, that we get it, right? But here's my problem. This is kind of my Žižekian critique of all this. Look, if we say that these extreme types of mystical encounters or extreme sexual acts or explosions of violence, if this is what jouissance is, then it seems like we don't have jouissance in our day-to-day lives. And that's my issue with these depictions of jouissance, right? So, like, a limit experience would be some sort of like absolutely intense jouissance. Well, I think there's a kind of micro jouissance throughout our day-to-day lives. And I think that's actually is what is so crucial to understand. So the way I would critique Bataille and the Lacan when he's making these gestures towards these kinds of extreme examples, right? I'd say, look, these limit experiences basically are functioning as a Baudrillardian third order simulation. Now, what do I mean when I bring in Baudrillard here? Baudrillard in Simulacra and Simulation, one of his famous examples is Disneyland. And what does he do with this? Like, why is Disneyland a simulation, a third order simulation for him? Well, it's because Disneyland, he doesn't use the term ideological. He's going to use the term simulation, but it's close to the same thing in how it functions. Disneyland serves a simulatory or ideological purpose. And what it is, it's like, okay, you concentrate extreme images of immaturity, of childishness, right? In Disneyland. You go to Disneyland, you know you're in child world, right? But the point is what that covers over, what that dissimulates, right? What it conceals is that all of America is childish, right? There's nothing mature about Americans in general. But if you dump or if you concentrate all of these excessive images of immaturity in one spot, it simulates that the what's outside of it is mature, right? Well, I see a similar thing at work here. If we take these extreme limit experiences and we say that's the bastion of jouissance, that's where it's at, right? Then all of our daily lives seem to be lacking in jouissance. It's not present throughout our day-to-day lives because most of us, as we go through our day-to-day lives, are not experiencing, thankfully, extreme acts of torture or doing drugs to the point of just complete mental collapse and breakdown, right? So if that's jouissance, we don't have it. But the point is, we do have it. And so what I want to call it is that throughout our day-to-day lives, we microdose jouissance, right? It's this microdosing of jouissance that actually is what functions ideologically for us, right? And these fantasies of extreme acts of enjoyment, they spur us on, they intrigue us, etc. Because in a sense, you could say they keep us going because it's like, and they don't have to all have this violent dimension. Like one of the fantasies of extreme jouissance, at least for a lot of us, would be winning the lottery, right? Because if you win the lottery and you win a big lottery, you suddenly have access to all of these ways of life, or you can get away with crimes. At least a lot of the times, it buys you what, at least from a poor person's perspective or a working class person's perspective, it buys you access to a domain of jouissance that none of us currently have access to, right? So these images, these fantasies of extreme forms of jouissance, be they what we think of are violent or non-violent, almost irrelevant, they keep us chasing this idea of impossible jouissance, of this jouissance above and beyond our day-to-day lives. And that the social unconscious is going to provide us with different fantasies that keep us going, that serve as lures, that keep us chasing some sort of vision of a future where we have it all, where we attain happiness with a capital H, right? But the problem is, we never have that type of jouissance. It's impossible. It doesn't exist, right? It only exists in fantasy. What our bodily enjoyment in our day-to-day lives consists of is the partial jouissance of the drives. Like, yeah, we get certain jouissance from what we're doing. For everybody who was in the seminar 11 course, what we look at with what we're doing with our eyes, what we're doing with our ears, what we're doing with our mouths, right? These are these core spots on our body that stimulate us, give us partial jouissance, etc. So the thing is, right, this is this great trick, like this whole ideology or simulation through concentration. So that's what we have with Baudrillard talking about maturity. That's what we have when we apply that to, you know, these Bataille limit experiences. And, you know, you also thinking about it, because Dave's been talking about Bourdieu a lot. This is another issue we have with this ideological mechanism of concentration. So in Bourdieu, with how he thinks about the forms of capital, right? There's a tendency for us to only concentrate on capital that is economic, right? It's the Marxist, the clear-cut Marxist form of economic capital, you know, exploitation, wages, realization of surplus value in the purchase, that whole thing, right? What that does, though, is it acts like, oh, well, what's outside of that isn't capital, right? When in fact it's a sprawling network, right? The whole social field is capital, insofar as there's cultural capital and social capital, which are completely related to the functioning of economic capital. But if you focus in on a concentrated view on economic capital, you miss the rest of what capital is doing. And so this this thing of like hyper focusing, hyper concentrating on one aspect of the thing, we always have to guard against that when it comes to understanding the social unconscious, because what you find that you're isolating, and again, I mean, it's almost Heideggerian, right? Heidegger would say, if you de-world an object, you don't really understand the object. If you take a pen and I go, okay, this is a present at hand object, it has a certain shape, it has certain colors, etc. What I obfuscate is how the pen has to work with paper, and the paper is working with my computer, and my computer is working with the books around me, and it's a whole network of equipment, right? So if you focus in on one aspect or one thing, at the cost of depriving yourself of how it fits into a network, then that's obviously a problem when it comes to investigation. And this is part of what Dave's doing, you know, with the whole concept of time energy, right? Like, how does time energy function in the social unconscious, right? Well, the point is, you want to say, well, there's obviously people who they'll concoct a lot of stories to justify why certain people have to do the hard essential labor and other people don't, right? But the point of the matter is, you know, whether we want to call them the aristocrats or the capitalist class, etc., the rich, the 1%, right? They know on some level that having time energy is essential to building up a type of person that I guess is worthy of their capital inheritance, right? You know, if you're rich, you know, okay, I don't want my kid just surfing around on their iPhone all day and wasting away in school. I want to get them far better education, which usually means less school, right? Because you can do in 3 hours a day if you're really doing serious education. You know, when it takes what, 16 hours at a bullshit school to do. So the point is, they understand the importance of time energy. Now, whether or not does the capitalists have his time energy, I mean, that's a whole nother issue, right? Because the logic of capital seems to make it where, you know, speed up, speed up, speed up. Like, the capitalists that I've actually known don't seem to have their time energy. It's their kids that have it, right? It's the kids that get it. So, but this is all part of
If
how
even.
the forms of capital tie together when you analyze them in relation to time energy, right? Basically, like, there's there's no science, there's no philosophy, there's no art in the traditional sense without time energy, without odium, without skele, right? And so if you got to spend your life doing all the necessary labor to help reproduce society, well, then you want to chime in, Dave?
Yeah, I'll just add that increasingly the children of the wealthy are perhaps least privileged when it comes to time energy. Now, obviously, there are exceptions. Like the good exception, I think it was like, wasn't it Freddie Roosevelt who said like, I did business so that my children can do, or I forget who it was, but someone famous like that said, I do business so that my children can do liberal arts. But that's a mentality that is rare in the bourgeoisie, and it's increasingly rare, especially nowadays with the increased fear of falling. And so it's like, no, you're actually under this tremendous pressure to capitalize your time and to instrumentalize it, even if you're a trust fund kid, because you got to prove that you're not going to waste it, right? That's all I want to say.
Yeah, but no, but hold on, but it is like a really recent development, right? Because
Yeah.
traditionally, the bourgeois wanted their kids to be able to spend their times developing their cultural capital, and so then the question is, well, is cultural capital kind of on the decline? Where, I mean, think about it. Like, does Kim Kardashian, does she have cultural capital in the way we don't? It almost seems like she doesn't. She has social capital in the way we don't. She has connections to powerful people, but does she really have some sort of knowledge of bourgeois culture? Because the problem is there really bourgeois culture anymore? Right? That this is this like isn't bourgeois culture almost our culture? Marvel movies and Netflix, and I mean the stars in Hollywood sit around and watch the same shows we watch. Um, Now you can say, well, maybe what their cultural capital is their kind of celebrity activism, or what we don't see behind the scenes of I know how to I know how to present myself at the Cannes Film Festival, shit like that, right? Maybe, but it just doesn't seem like cultural capital is having the same importance in the reproduction of capital that it once did. And if that's the case, then you're right. Like we can see even the capitalist class, children included, not needing time energy because they're not trying to develop this sprawling knowledge of cultural capital. I mean, what do you think of that?
Yeah, and I would also just say that the cultural capital has changed. Like, what does it actually mean? Has changed. Where it and maybe it was already changed by the time Bourdieu was talking about it, where it became more important to show evidence that you knew the right names of all the right, whether it was high art or vulgar pop art, it didn't matter. Like the point was it was this accumulation of names that you can drop and associations that you can make, as opposed to this more Cartesian notion of the liberal arts, where it's like the point of that otium or that skole, that freed time without constraints and economic necessity, is so that you can do it yourself. Not so that you can say, oh, yeah, I read James Joyce. I have opinions about James Joyce. Oh, yeah, I have opinions about Deleuze and Guattari. No, so that you could actually do philosophy. So you could actually, so it's not just like, oh, yeah, I went to all the plays and I enjoyed the opera. It's also, no, but I am a musician, right? Like I spend time making music so that I can better appreciate music. And now it's like, it's so hollowed out. It really is just this accumulation of like references, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Which we could assign value.
Right.
Okay, so I just want to close a little bit more, but then I'm going to hand it back over to Dave. So yeah, I mean, the key I want to emphasize is just this microdosing of jouissance, and that we microdose jouissance at work, at the coffee shop, at school, in our romantic relationships, in our family drama, in traffic, at the bar, at restaurants, while shopping, while engaging in online politics, and it's all that's where jouissance actually has a hold on us. So we need to not fall for the Bataille's almost like Baudrillardian simulatory mistake here, which is don't just think it's in those experiences. you have to start seeing how jouissance is in the mundane reality of our lives. Again, that we microdose it throughout the day, and that's where the real social unconscious of jouissance is at. That's where our inherent transgression is at, and not in these limit experiences. So, and again, I said it earlier, but this is the one of the big contributions Žižek makes to the theory of ideology. That ideology is not just about meaning; it's not about false consciousness or representations or thoughts that get us acting in the interest of the capitalist or the oppressing class, etc. Its real hold is these micro doses of jouissance that it gives us, right? But different aspects of society can give us different types of jouissance, and this is where we get into this whole thing of the big other, or the one, Das Mann, right? The big normie, the normie of all normies. So, what so much of us are dealing with in America is that we don't feel like there's a overarching consensus that really, we talk about the post-class fractured mass, right? What we have is like the big other has fractured. And at one point in this country, despite, I'm not saying it was without antagonisms at one point, no, but there was enough of a social consensus that, people on both sides of the aisle had no problem sitting down and, going to a barbecue with their neighbors and, going and seeing, like, it wasn't as sharp as it is now. And because we talk about echo chambers, right? Well, really what we have is the fracturing of the big other into what I'm just going to call little big others, right? So you have the liberal left has one, and the old school centrists have theirs, and then the Trump MAGA people have theirs, and then the Marxists have theirs. And what you find is that the big other, basically, people are trapped, or whatever. They might even have fidelity to it. Doesn't matter. They're operating within a fractured big other, and they're trying to assert their big other as the new consensus. And this is this weird tension we find ourselves in, especially online, is that we're constantly having to navigate our way through the fracturation of the big other into multiple, not little others or other others in the sense of human beings, but little big others, right? And so what this entails is, you guys know what Russian dolls are, or if I'm probably going to butcher the word, matryoshka dolls, right? Stacking dolls, nesting dolls, Russian tea dolls. They're different terms for them, but what they are, they're a set of wooden dolls of decreasing size placed one inside another, right? And the name matryoshka, mainly known as little matron, is blah 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 blah. Okay, female. That's all relevant. The point is, one little doll goes into another doll, goes into another little doll, goes into another, right? And this image of the Russian doll helps us understanding, like, we have to scale the big other, right? So you could be like, if you're a Marxist, yeah, you're kind of you're operating within your own symbolic space governed by your own big other. But then Marxists themselves disagree on all kinds of stuff, right? And so then you find yourself in a smaller big other, and then that group can divide, and you find yourself in an even smaller big other. But the point is, there is a way where these smaller big others still depend on a larger big others, especially, like, say, if you speak one language, if you're in America and you're in the English speaking world, right? You're locked into, like, that's kind of your fundamental big other, right? And then, okay, well, being able to do what one does in philosophy in the English speaking world, that would be the next doll down. And then knowing your way around Marxist theory within philosophy, that's another doll, in smaller doll, right? And you just keep going down to and so we're always having to basically code switch, right? Like, it is this term that I think is helpful here, which is the ability to switch over with efficiency, right? Being able to navigate yourself in different social scenarios governed by different big others. And, you know, it's funny, right? In some sense, we're all Dexter. If you guys know Dexter, you know the TV show. He's basically was a kid. He was going to be a serial killer, and his dad was a cop, and so he saw that this kid was going to become your typical serial killer, and so he totally lacks empathy. He is a sociopath, psychotic, however you want to talk about it. But what his dad did as a cop is he gave him like cognitive rules of performing morality. It's almost Kantian, right? Like you don't relate to other people via empathy. You don't relate to them based on feeling or a warm fuzzy connection. It's almost like a mathematical procedure. And for Dexter, what okay, so he has the violent impulse to kill, but he's learned to basically just I'm only going to use that against horrible people who kill and do terrible things to other people. So he's a serial killer that kills serial killers because he has some sort of like code or Kantian morality that legislates for him. Thing is, what the show Dexter does, and this is the real point, is that Dexter doesn't really get social situations, right? But he's learned how to code switch and he's perfected this art of fitting in, even though he doesn't fit in the way that those of us with empathy or that ability to occupy somebody else's perspective or etc. Right? So we're all doing this in a sense. I'm not saying we're social, but I'm saying when you're in a social order that has fractured the way ours have, if you want to get along with people, right, you have to learn how to get along in spaces with people that you don't relate to on on an immediate level. So I do this all the time. Like, so my two coffee shops, one of them is down by UMKC, the college campus. That's where all the liberal left kids hang out, right? And it has that vibe totally. But then the other one I go to is a Christian fundamentalist coffee shop out in the suburbs, right? And I get along great with everybody at both of them. And but I also know like there's different ways to present yourself, what to talk about, what not to, right? And the point is I have enough familiarity with what one does in a liberal leftist coffee shop, and I have enough familiarity with what one does at a Christian fundamentalist coffee shop that I'm able to code switch. But that is what we're finding more and more we have to do as the
Except
math fractures.
except for that one time when you're talking about what
Yeah,
is sex and you forgot to code switch.
yeah, I wasn't doing what one does, right? I was talking about Alenka Zupancic out loud at a Christian coffee shop, and that didn't go over well. And the big other came over and scorned me for it and let me know, hey, uh, that's basically what the barista said, is that that's not what one does here. So, but apart from that, there's never been any issues. But I think this is this whole thing of multiple big others that are actually little big others, and then you have little big others. This whole Russian doll scenario. But then the other issue, and I'll close it with this, is that here's the issue: is that when it comes to the big other, that's been fractured, or you're dealing with people who are just from two different big others, there's always the possibility of what Leotard calls a differend. Somebody asked me, they were like, why don't you teach the differend? And I'm like, okay, well, fair enough, I'll do it this week. So the differend is basically, in a nutshell, what happens when you have two people from two different symbolic orders come into some sort of conflict with each other. And based on the fact that there's just no consensus between their big others, they're just left with basically an irresolvable contradiction, because the only way for them to reach common ground would be to, in some way, deeply modify their own big other, which would be to remake the big other and the other's image and likeness, etc. So Okay, so this whole thing with differend of the big others. So simply put, a differend is a deadlock that occurs when different symbolic orders, different language games, different frames of reference collide at a point of aporetic incompatibility. So as Leotard says in the differend, as distinguished from a litigation, a differend would be a case of conflict between at least two parties that cannot be resolved for lack of a rule of judgment applicable to both of the arguments. One side's legitimacy does not imply the other's lack of legitimacy. However, applying a single rule of judgment to both in order to settle the differend as though it were merely a litigation would be wrong. At least one of them, and both of them, if would be wrong for one of them, and both of them if neither side admits this rule. Okay, so that's the issue: is that there's no other of the other. So you have two big others, and the only way to kind of mediate the situation would to have an other of these, like a transcendent big other that would rule over them. But the point is, and this is Lacan's point as well as Leotard, there's no other universal other of the other to appeal to here. And the only way to fucking get one side to get their way is to basically just violently disregard the position of the other side, right? So what we have here is a socio-symbolic impasse wherein there is no higher order, no overarching code or rule that can resolve the predicament. The trouble is that the two parties cannot simply accept it as a stalemate, shake hands, and walk away. Things hang in the balance for both sides. This is a relatively easy concept to understand, but we still need a good example. And thankfully, Simon Malthus gives a wonderfully lucid description of a differend. Okay, so this is from Malthus's book. It's just called Jean-Francois Lyotard. It's in the Routledge Critical Philosopher series, one of them. So Malthus says, imagine that you are an Australian judge. This story is based on a series of events that have happened recently in Australian courts. Before you are two plaintiffs. The first is a construction company who wants to build a new development on an island. The second is a group of Aboriginal women who claim that the island is a religious site for their community. If what the women say is true, then the development, which has already cost the company many thousands of dollars, must be scrapped and the land returned. This, the company will tell you, will probably bankrupt them and force them to make their staff redundant, right? In order to substantiate their claim, the women must prove in court that the island really is a holy site. But this is where the problem arises. You were told by the women's lawyer that, according to their beliefs, they can only discuss the meaning of the site amongst themselves. The site's holiness rests on the belief that it remains a secret passed down from mother to daughter along the generations. And if this secret is revealed to a man or to anyone outside their group, then the site loses its holiness. They are thus trapped. According to the law, if they don't provide evidence in court, then they lose the case. If they do speak out, then they must reveal the secret, which means that the site loses its holiness in their eyes, and again, they lose the case. This is like Lacan talks about the forced choice, right? If you choose meaning, you lose your meaning and being, and if you choose being, you lose your being and meaning, blah, 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 right? This is the problem with which you, as the judge, are faced. You have no possible way of knowing whether or not the women are telling the truth, as they cannot give evidence in court. On the one hand, there is the possibility that you will wrong the women by allowing a place that is sacred to them to be destroyed. On the other hand, you run the risk of bankrupting a company and making its workers redundant. What do? Any legal decision made by the judge will necessarily wrong one or both of the plaintiffs because they cannot adduce the same sorts of proof to support the claims. According to Lyotard, then, a differend is signaled by this inability to prove. The one who lodges a complaint is heard, but the one who is the victim of a wrong and who is perhaps the same one is reduced to silence. The women put in an impossible situation before the court are reduced to silence and become victims of the judicial system. Or if the judge decides in their favor, the developers are wronged because the court has employed rules that are different from those established in law to find against them. So, point is, what this goes to show is one, there are multiple big others, and two, each is incomplete or barred or shot through with lack, i.e., each lacks the ability to assimilate and accommodate aspects of other big others, as well as aspects of the real. And three, there is no meta language, meta narrative, or meta discourse that can mediate all symbolic orders. Lyotard defined our postmodern condition in terms of our disbelief in the reality of a meta narrative or grand story that can reconcile all discourse. This is the defining feature of our particular symbolic order. So the point is, what is the proper like Leotardian response to this? Well, on some aspect, like of course you want to defend your symbolic order, but if you don't want to just be basically have this kind of conquering impulse to disregard all others, you do have to stand open to other big others, right? And this leads into Levinas. It's interesting, right? Because Levinas wants us to always stand open to the other as a concrete person, the mysterious void or the enigmatic surplus within the concrete other person, right? That is not reducible to our concepts or our totalizing ways of viewing things, right? Well, for Lyotard, it's almost Levinasian, but applied to the big other itself, where you have to have some sort of recognition of the worth, integrity, etc., of other symbolic orders. If you're not just going to allow yours to just conquer and basically impose itself on every situation. And part of it is understanding that perhaps, and not just perhaps, that your own framework is lacking, that there's something it can't get at, that it can't make sense of, and perhaps, just perhaps, somebody else's symbolic order can understand that thing in a different way that you're incapable of. So I think part of our social unconscious is understanding that our symbolic order itself is lacking. It's incapable of mastering everything, understanding everything, and that different symbolic orders can get at truths that ours cannot. So with that, Dave, you're gone now, but when Dave comes back, I'll hand it over to him.
Tight, yeah.
Good job, man. That was awesome. I was like, I don't know, you were like 45 minutes in there, or like maybe even almost close to an hour in there. And then I was like, he hasn't even talked about the Russian doll effect yet. I was like, this whole thing's been about microdosing jouissance. Where's the part about the Russian? Okay, you did it though. You did it, and that was awesome. Yeah, you tied it all up. Beautiful. Yes, Zachary, we've got a couple minutes here for some questions. The fact is I'd like to take up to 10 minutes here to do some questions directly related to Mikey's presentation.
Okay, I have a question. Could you say that the ideological function of the big other and the superego is to keep out death drive? And if that is the case, would you see the way that Land, like, for example, Land tried to drive himself insane, or what Bataille calls limit experiences as being associated with this kind of fang noumena that's animated by death drive rather than jouissance, something different than to jouissance, something that's kind of more outside.
Well, I mean, the thing is, like, the build up to, like, so for Land, for example, right? I mean, the Fang Numenon in its purest form is just death itself, right? But the it's like Epictetus's great insight. Like, all right, well, if I'm not there once death is there, why do I worry about death? There's nothing menacing about death if I do not exist the moment that I encounter death, or that death is in my presence, right? So if death really is just simply non-existence, that we just cease to exist in every way imaginable, then there's nothing to fear about death, right? Death is only frightening if death isn't the actual end, right? But for Land, he's not going to believe in anything like the immortality of the soul. So actual death is just basically demise in the Heideggerian sense. It's just the end of our being. So for death to have this erotic charge, you have to pursue death without actually dying, right? That's what the thirst for annihilation is. And so in that sense, yeah, I mean, that's how he's going to tie it to death drive in his own way. Like, his concept of death drive it's not Lacanian, it's not Žižekian. It's more based on what we would say is the traditional misreading of Freud, which is death drive is this impulse to return to inanimate being, right? To die. Like, death drive is actually oriented towards literal death. And I think that's right for Land. It's just understanding that there is the thirst for annihilation. There is an enjoyment in the experience of dying, but not being dead yet, right? Like, that's what artificial death is. It's as close as you could come to basically experiencing death without actually dying. And so, yeah, for Land, like, that's exactly how he's going to think about death. But for Lacan and Žižek, Land isn't really thinking about death in terms of symbolic death, or the space between two deaths, as Lacan wants to talk about it, which is, for Lacan, the real death that is meaningful is an actual biological death. It's the death of our symbolic identity, right? It's this destroying our symbolic selves through some ethical act, and then restarting, then building ourselves back up again. And so the enjoyment is actually in the destruction of our social identities, and that's really where you see most people on an everyday level. They're always fucking up their pleasure or their social status by the types of relationships they have. They have a pattern of always being in toxic relationships that destabilizes their lives, right? Or they're always getting fired in the same way. They're always losing their job. They're fucking up at their job, and there's a pattern there. And so, again, like, what we think of as Lacanian Žižekians is more of these mundane examples, but no, for Land, it would be in this excessive Bataillean pursuit of undeath, or as experiencing death as closely as you can without actually dying. Yep. Any other questions, or should we let Dave go?
I got a question, Mikey.
Okay.
Well, actually, Ian put in the chat first if you have a recommendation for a first book to start with Bataille. So maybe you could answer that first before I get to my question.
Sure. Let's see. I'm gonna show you the cover of it, but I don't think. Oh, yep, right here.
Just Nick Land's The Thirst for Annihilation, baby.
Well, there's that, but the problem is, of course, Land is difficult, and Land, I've said this before, I think Land's book would actually, out of all the books written on Bataille, I think Land's book would be Bataille's favorite, because it's not doing the typical secondary, I'm going to introduce you to this important thinker. Land is really, he's writing a Bataillean book, right? And I think that's what he would like. But for those of us who do want a more scholarly introduction to Bataille, you cannot do better than William Pollitt's book. It's just called George Bataille, and this one is in uh, the Key Sociologists um, collection from Routledge. But yeah, really, really good stuff. He wrote another book. I'm drawing a blank on the name. It has to do with something sacrifice. Basically, William Pollitt's a guy. I'd love to interview him at some point if we can. He also wrote the Baudrillard book in this same series. So both those books are worth getting. And he thinks about sacrifice. He does a lot of stuff with Bataille and Baudrillard, and yeah, I highly recommend both those books. And the third one that I'm drawing a blank on the title, but he's really good. Okay, and so what was your other question?
All right, so I'll try to make this coherent, but my question, I believe, is you were mentioning this idea of almost like regulated chaos or like more structured chaos that's different from like what we traditionally think of as just order and chaos, that quick binary. Um, and so does it seem that a few philosophers have maybe almost been vying on the side of, especially maybe something like accelerationist, kind of going more of like, let's continue to keep exploring the chaos part, whereas maybe there's some other philosophical lines of thinking that are like, let's actually focus on this like regulated chaos because that's kind of the one that allows us to, I guess, not go psychotic or, go to death, but continue living. And yet we still have to deal with regulated chaos. Could you maybe talk about
Yeah.
who those thinkers you're thinking of or schools of thought between those?
Well, as far as this question of like basically managed chaos um, versus just total total chaos, honestly, it's D&G who are probably the best on this. So there's when you approach D&G, especially their two main works, Anti-Oedipus and A Thousand Plateaus, from a Landian perspective or CCRUian perspective, they're gonna put the emphasis on Anti-Oedipus, right? They're gonna say that's the better work. Not that they don't love a lot of what's in A Thousand Plateaus, but D&G actually make a big revision in how they think about capital and deterritorialization in A Thousand Plateaus that Land and CCRU aren't going to go for. So in Anti-Oedipus, what Land, at least in his reading of it, what he loves is that he wants to associate, even though D&G don't do this, he wants to link capital itself with absolute deterritorialization, which would be absolute chaos, basically. Basically, the complete destruction and overthrow of any traditional order, right? Now, D&G, it's not like this is a groundless reading. Like this is how D&G view what capital has basically done to traditional codes and overcodes, which is to say, local symbolic orders of tribes, and then more of like an imperial code or big other of the despot, of the ruler or the tyrant who reigns over a large varying collection of symbolic orders, right? The imperial overlord. And so what D&G say is that those symbolic orders are codes, they're regulatory, they seek to reproduce themselves through how they stabilize identity, etc. What and there are exceptions. Where I was talking to a guy in Theory Underground, David, about this, and he doesn't like this idea of these traditional symbolic orders being thought of in terms of identity. But I guess for me, like I are there things in the past where a traditional symbolic order could undergo a revision of itself? Sure. Wars could come in and destroy symbolic orders or whatever. Like D&G and Land, they knew that there was modifications of these symbolic orders and the various identities they gave, but it was very slow change. And some of them didn't, I think we could show, didn't change much at all, right? That once their established community and their laws and their gods and were they held those for a long time, right? What capital does is it comes in and it doesn't care about these kind of identities. It doesn't care about fixed codes or meanings or values. All it cares about is accumulation. And so what it's willing to do is it's willing to mix things up, deterritorialize, right? It's willing to reconfigure and reshape and recode and decode and deterritorialize and decontextualize, mixing everything up. And this isn't really even D&G. Marx understood this, and Marx and Engels, and they talk about this thing in Communist Manifesto. So they're aware of that capital melts all that's solid into air, right? And so that's this thing. The issue is that D&G understand that capital is not full on deterritorialization. It's not full on destruction of identity and codes. It does reterritorialize. It uproots and then it roots us back as wage laborers, as consumers, etc. But for Land, the way he read it, he wants to just identify capital with deterritorialization as such. Okay, so that's anti-Oedipus. What he doesn't like about what this move D&G make in 1,000 Plateaus is this. They end up thinking, no, like, there's different ways to deterritorialize. There's different rates at which one can deterritorialize. And they come to actually, in this book, associate like absolute deterritorialization, not with capitalism, but with fascism. And Land is sitting there going, no, like fascism is not deterritorialization. It's not uprooting. It's not decoding. It's a reassertion of identity when things have gotten, when capital has deterritorialized or destabilized, and so he finds it this weird move, and but no, like D&G when they're talking about how to make yourself a body without organs or whatever, yes, it's all heavy in terminology, but what they're thinking about is there's managed deterritorialization as opposed to just unbridled, going for zero, going for social collapse, deterritorialization, which they now associate with fascism. But I'm actually with Land on this. I think they were better linking deterritorialization with capital than with fascism. But basically, if you want more on this, like it's definitely worth revisiting 1,000 Plateaus and Brent Atkins. That's the best commentary you're going to find on it. It helped influence how I read the book. So I would check out that. Dave, you're up.
You're up. All right, sweet. I'll do it. I'll do it, guys. I'll do it, and I'll keep it to a relatively short. I'm just kidding. I'm not gonna say from the outset how long or how short this is gonna be. It will be. Here's my intention: to get this over with fast enough so that people who are trying to get out of here and go on with their day after being in a live session with us can do so, and then leaving plenty of time for going deeper, right? Leaving plenty of time for going deeper with the people who are able to stay. Let me just fix the view here so I can see you all. There we go.
I just want to say, if you end up having to go longer, I got to leave it too. So if you go long and you're in the middle of, you've got a vibe going, just keep going. Everybody, it's been great. And I'm just doing this in case I have to leave. But yeah.
And what time is it there right now?
Right now it's 12:43.
Okay, sweet. Yeah, no, that'll be fine. I want to get it over with enough time for you to be able to say a few things, for us to be able to take questions from everybody. And yeah. All right, and I want to preface this by saying thank you to the I think 6 people so far who are at tier 4 now so that they can get the privileges of access to the seminar that I am doing with Anne, the seminar that I am doing that is a deep dive, which is a new thing, and then Mikey's seminar as well. Tier 4 at Mikey's seminar or at the Snellgrove McKerracher synthesis seminar, either one unlocks all seminars at Theory Underground. That's the idea there. And so, thank you. Give it up for all the people who have signed up for that. And, like in Nance's case, he was already a tier 4 subscriber, but several people upgraded their subscriptions, or there are a few people who've maintained their $30 a month subscription for my seminar, mine and Anne's seminar, and then they've added a $30 subscription for Mikey's seminar. That's also a great way to do it if you're not looking for full access, because tier 4 grants full access to everybody. Tier 4 unlocks tier 3 access to all the seminars, right? But if you don't desire tier 3 access, then you might just do tier 2 at both. You'll save a little bit of money that way. Now, I have to say that as a way of transitioning here, because this is just going to go out on the channel. And I do want people to realize this stuff's happening every week at Theory Underground. If there's a special week for some reason we're not doing one of these Sunday seminar sessions or something special on a Saturday, then that's just the exception to the rule. But the general thing is that almost on a weekly basis, we've got something going on, and it is like this deeper dive stuff. Part of the goal of these is to break down concepts, thinkers, and texts that are essential to empowering you as an independent thinker. Now, you might remember that I talked a couple times ago about burnout and me basically saying, don't go so hard that you're just going to burn out on this stuff. And then in that conversation, I talked about how in some cases, this is just a phase of life for you. You're going to spend anywhere between 3 and 18 months, studying philosophy. And then you're going to move into something else. You might go into some kind of a career that keeps you completely busy all the time. You might go into religion and decide, you know what, I've got a pastor. I don't really need to think for myself. I'll just go on Sunday and be edified by what the pastor has to say. But the assumption is that while you're here, you're trying to think for yourself. And by the way, I do want to say it is valid to treat philosophy as a phase of life. I want to market philosophy as the Rumspringa of the mind. The Rumspringa is the Amish freedom from religion that is granted to everyone who reaches a certain age. I think it starts at 16, where they're basically free. They keep living at their parents' house if they want to, but they can technically move out. They get to party. They get to do meth if they want. I mean, they're encouraged to literally partake in the world. And because the city kids, the secular city kids who live outside of the Amish community need a place to party, they'll often connect up with kids in Rumspringa and use the back 50 acres of some Amish farm to do their rager. They'll have giant bonfires, right? Well, you can't do that in the city. So these city kids, these secular kids, they come and they party it up with these Amish kids. These Amish kids get to use cell phones. They get to go on the internet. They get to watch the Marvel Cinematic Universe. They get to do the things of this world. And that's called Rumspringa. Nance and I, for the last year and a half, have been calling the university the liberal or progressive Rumspringa, meaning that it's your opportunity before becoming a professional or manager of capital to rebel, to party. Yeah, you still have to get your homework assignments in on time if you want to be deserving of a higher paid salary, whatever. But especially if you want to keep getting money from your parents. But the basic idea of the university is this sort of ever since the 1960s, it's kind of the extension of the sexual revolution. It's the extension of the experimentation with psychedelics or of drinking and seeing how many people you can't hook up with in a week, right? And I don't know that I don't know if it's that extreme for everybody. I'll never forget this one gal I met at the university whose goal was to see how many guys she could be with in a year. And she was doing an art project where she painted all of their penises from memory. So, you know, it's a little extreme. It's a little obsessive. It's a little weird. But, you know, props, whatever. You know, it's from Springer. You know, this is your opportunity to do the thing. And then someday when you're old, you could say, oh, yes, I used to be crazy like those kids. I used to do all kinds of things. And for the people who aren't doing so much like this sexual adventurism, they're at least probably doing some kind of activism, some kind of a renunciation of the world. But neither of these options gets at what I'm thinking about when I think of Rumspringa for the mind. Those progressive college students are not necessarily achieving Rumspringa of the mind. Maybe you could argue that there's some kind of a Rumspringa of the mind, or at least a simulation of it that comes through psychedelics. But it's not lasting. That's why I call it a simulation. Not only is it not lasting, but it probably turns you into a narcissistic know-it-all who actually doesn't know anything, but thinks that you're so enlightened because you can say that at least, right? But you've met God at this point, right? You've met God. You've seen how fake the world really is. That's the kind of idea. That's the kind of experience that people report. But Rumspringa of the mind, it's not about partying. It's about taking your fundamental presuppositions to task. Taking the words that you use and reuse and become super dependent upon and subjecting them to the fires of intense scrutiny. It means trying to take up the positions of the radical other from which to see your own taken for granted world, right? I want to market philosophy this way because this is what philosophy has always been in the first place, at least to me and Mikey and our general approach. But also because I think that getting outside of, or at least decentering and deconstructing or dismantling the intuitive givenness of your worldview and its concepts or ideas is a necessary step in the passage into understanding the current situation, which is at Theory Underground ultimately what we're all about, right? Yes, activism, fantastic. But for what? To what end? Just to keep repeating the same old slogans that were coined by your grandparents at this point in the 60s? Come on. Are we going to ever break out of these loops that we're in? Well, I hope so. And that's the goal. And I think that this starts with thinking about this idea of the Russian doll of the big other as Russian doll, or the plural big other, the radically pluralized big other. We could almost think about it as like a fractal, except that a fractal, and if you don't know what fractals are, just go Google image search while we talk, but it's basically an image that repeats itself infinitely in usually a spiral, right? And so the more you zoom in or the more you zoom out, the more you see the same thing. I love fractals. Everyone loves fractals. If you've never really looked at fractals, you got to check them out. But the Russian doll of the big other is not quite like the fractal, at least not your average fractal. I'd love to see a fractal that symbolizes what I'm about to get at here. But what I'm trying to get at is a bit more complicated because this is a field. We're all finding ourselves in a field that is defined by antagonisms between big others, right? The fractal effect, which is also the psychedelic way of seeing things, is everything's connected, everything's synthesized, everything is one. Whereas the Žižekian dialectical approach would be to say, no, everything is constituted by its contradictions, and those contradictions are often mutually irreconcilable. And they're not reconciled through a state of higher synthesis. They're actually, there are irreconcilable impasses at work, right? So I have up here on the whiteboard the symbolic order, the said, big other, and superego. Existence equals a prison. I know that sounds like we're going to get into some Foucault here, but no, this is Levinas. This is Levinas. Existence is a prison. Levinas beat Foucault. to the punch, I think. But the said is probably the only term here that hasn't really been unpacked. We get the symbolic order at a certain level. It includes both the big other and the superego. But then, of course, the symbolic order, like if we're thinking about America, that symbolic order holds within itself all of these competing agencies and competing institutions and competing groups, many of which are mutually constitutive in their contradictions, right? So no wonder we feel ourselves split. No wonder we feel ourselves not at home. No wonder we find it difficult to connect with other people. No wonder we're not sure how to go about making friends or going on dates. No wonder conversations that happen outside of people who are in super secure and niche little church kind of communities are mostly conversations about boundaries. That's because if you're not in a super insular kind of church community where everything's kind of, oh yeah, we know how we do things, it's all based in tradition and this is how it's done. Outside of that, people are aware we don't know what one does. And the most grotesque and obnoxious, or at least frustrating, tendency of the progressive liberal left, I think, today, is to kind of erase that fact. So it's like, yes, while it is the fact that everybody who's not doing network marketing or sales types of meetings at the coffee shop and who's not doing Bible studies at the coffee shop is probably talking about their polyamorous relationships and the boundaries that they're trying to navigate in those relationships, there is on Twitter, or I guess Threads or wherever you find progressives today, this kind of assumption that it's just given. It's just given. The big other and its rules are just given. We just know this. It's just obvious, right? Which is kind of the opposite of this diverse, cosmopolitan kind of world where we live in difference, surrounded by difference, and we keep ourselves open to difference. We don't try to colonize difference. We don't try to dominate difference. We don't try to tell radically different people how they're going to have to be. No, that progressive idea, though I think most people would probably agree to it at some level, is kind of passé because it's just given. This is part of just how reactionary the two-party political system is today, the duopoly is today. It's just given how we are to act. It's just obvious. And if it's not obvious to you, then you're probably cringe. And the connection of cringe to norms and rules and law, as well as the inherent the inherent transgression that holds together groups. That is what we want to look at. That's what we want to call into question. And that's what we have to do if we want to do this from Spring of the Mind. Now, not everybody's going to have to read Levinas. Not everyone's going to have to read Heidegger. Please don't anybody read Lacan ever. Don't worry about these guys, right? Obviously, and I say that only half in jest. Jacob and Terrence are amazing for the way that they are able to read Lacan. So is Mikey. But, as Žižek said, the best way to read Lacan is to read somebody who's read Lacan, right? Unless you're committed to becoming a Lacanian for the rest of your life, you should probably just read other people who read Lacan, right? And the same thing goes to some extent for all of these thinkers. For me, thinking about what is this thing that we're doing here? What is this function that we're serving? What is this monthly subscription for a person who might only do it for 3 to 18 months on average? Like what do I want that person to get from this? And how do I make sure that that person gets a quality experience that will, set them up for a better life for the rest of their life versus talking to instead an assumed audience of people who are planning on doing this for the rest of their life, for people who are looking to become theorists, looking to become professors, looking to do underground theory as a way of life, potentially for the rest of their lives. And I think part of it is if you're this person who's not sure which one you are, remaining open and living in the question, as Rilke says in his letter to a young poet. He says, you have to live in the question. you know? And I think that living in the question is how to do continental philosophy. I've said a lot of times at this point that the way to read a continental philosopher who doesn't give you a list of definitions and a glossary for all of the words that they're using, the way to read them is whenever you don't know what a word means, instead of looking it up, because even if you look it up, it's probably wrong, is to turn that word into an algebraic placeholder. And I want to talk about like what that means and bring it back to, hold on, I got to change the view here. What that means. Yeah, there we go. What that means in the case of the progressive who assumes, oh yeah, everybody agrees this is how one ought to be, is to instead like return into the question and be in like this sort of open-minded space of like, actually, I'm not even sure what I believe, and I definitely should not jump to any sort of conclusions about what the other believes, much less the plurality of others. Because if every self in the society has a plurality of big others competing, well then, how much more so can you say that every concrete other is going to be impossible to reduce to a simple category or concept within a simplistic framework? Okay, that's the beginning. Now, I wanted to say something about the said. I put the said on the side of the symbolic order. And on the other side here, I say versus the saying. The said versus the saying is a crucial distinction for Levinas. And though I don't expect everybody to become Levinasians or to become well-versed in Levinas, which is a huge task, you know, it's like Heidegger and Levinas and Lacan. We're talking like you don't have time to become a Hegelian, much less all these other thinkers, right? Well, I want you to keep this sort of question mark over all of these great names of great theorists. Just put question marks over them and use them and all of their concepts as sort of algebraic placeholders. And in a sort of sense, that is what Levinas is getting at when he talks about the saying as opposed to the said. The said is the book of dead words. The said is the dictionary, where everything's been predefined, and it's as simple as looking it up. You ask a genuine question, and someone responds with, Google it. Their assumption when they say that is, well, of course, we already know. We know the answer to this. Even if I don't know it off the top of my head, Google knows it. That's the saying. Or sorry, no, it's the opposite. It's the said. The said is the body of things that have been said and the ways they have been defined and prescribed. Described and prescribed. Definitions lock down meanings and serve them up on a silver platter and say, this is what that means. Whereas this philosophical kind of thinking that lives in the question, yes, ultimately we're going to lock things down as rigid designators when we're in the midst of a conversation, right? Kripke calls it a rigid designator when you say, well, when I say tree, I mean X, Y, and Z, not A, B, and C. Now let's have a conversation about trees, right? You're making sure to lock it down ahead of time so that we're not just having this wishy-washy kind of conversation where it's all up in the air and everybody thinks that they know what they're talking about, but they're talking past one another, right? That's not what we're talking about. The saying is what I'm doing right now. It's talking. It's not this dead body of letters. It's the enunciation of a subjectivity that is living and breathing in a body, in a place, in a time, and is not reducible to any of the things that it has said. None of you are reducible to the things that you have said. If I wanted to try to reduce you to something that you have said, I might want to do that just so I can get rid of you. I might want to do that so I can fold you into someone else. I might want to do that so that I can collapse you into this idea that is either for or against me, right? so that I can say that you are one of the good ones or one of the bad ones. Much more terrifying, though, much more disconcerting for Levinas is the fact that that's impossible. Others are not numbers. Others are not statistics. Others are, like you, like me, concrete. And as Heidegger would say, being there. Being in the world. Right? Dasein, being in the world. Being there, thrown into a situation, but singularly placeable in space and time. And not in some kind of abstract space and time, but one that has a history. One that has a language, one that has its others, one that has its big others, right? That's the saying over the said. And I put it on the side of the symbolic order because, I mean, just think of like, I don't know, law, judges, right? The justice in the world of the law requires us to go back and look at how judgments have been made in the past so that we can find some precedence for making a judgment now. And this is inescapable outside of the law, just in our average everyday life. It's also inescapable. We're always going to kind of be in this relationship to the past and to what has been said. But even for Heidegger, who Levinas would probably see as just like this terrible totalizer, even for Heidegger, there's a responsibility to bring what has been said into the present, to be responsible for interpreting. Now, I think Heidegger, where he's going to part ways with Levinas here, is that Heidegger thinks that there is this sort of source power in the roots of words, especially Greek ones. He's got this hard on for Greek, right? Oh yeah, the genuine insights are included in the roots of these philosophical words. We can go back to them and unpack them. And that is in Being in Time. It's got its little moments, his weird sort of hermeneutic ontology of etymology, right? He does that in Being in Time a couple of times. And at one point he says that is the task of philosophy, is renewing the power of these old words. Yeah, he says that, but that doesn't become his defining mode until much later in his life, when he's kind of doing this poetic turn thing that I'm personally not that interested in. No, Levinas, and he says this in Ethics and Infinity, he says to Philippe Nemo in one of those interviews, he says, no, the saying is more important than dead words. It's what we do with those dead words, and it's how we orient ourselves to them and how we understand ourselves with recourse to these words that ultimately is the most defining thing of philosophy. But Levinas, his critique of Heidegger and his critique of Husserl and his critique of Hegel, as well as the rest of the history of philosophy, is in a nutshell that all of them are obsessed with being. They're obsessed with being. And of course, it's very famous, like in this book, Being in Time, Heidegger starts out by saying philosophers have never really thought about being, right? He says, do we in our time have an answer to the question of what we really mean by the word being? Not at all. So it is fitting that we should raise anew the question of the meaning of being. But are we nowadays even perplexed at our inability to understand the expression being? Not at all. So first of all, we must reawaken an understanding for the meaning of this question. And for Levinas, as well as it seems like most people, they see Heidegger as the thinker of being. Thomas Sheehan will come along and say he's not the thinker of being, he's a thinker of the meaning of being, which is actually a pretty big difference. I think there's something to what Sheehan is getting at, even if Sheehan doesn't get the full story. That's a big question mark. I just put over all of that. I'm not really interested in getting to the bottom of it here. It's something that I aim to keep thinking about for the next 5 or 10 years, right? But no, the question of being is not the same thing as let's get to the bottom of what being actually is, right? But that is kind of where Levinas goes with it, is that Heidegger is, like all the rest of the philosophers, fundamentally preoccupied with this, like, what is real question. Like, what is real? What is being? What is isness? What are the kinds of being? You know, what are the modes of being? Metaphysics and ontology. But for Levinas, ethics is first philosophy. And so this is the, you know, as far as like the canonical series of lectures this year at Theory Underground, the first time that I've really gone into Levinas. And so I'll say a couple words about him for anyone who's not super familiar, but basically he studied under Husserl. And because he was in Freiburg at the time, this is in the mid to late 1920s, he discovered Heidegger, and everybody was reading Being and Time. And Levinas was like, what's that book all about? So he gets his hands on it, and he was like, holy smokes, this is the best book in the world. And then he went to the Davos conference where Heidegger debated Cassirer, who was a neo-Kantian, and Heidegger decimated this neo-Kantian. And Levinas dressed up as a donkey during the party, and everybody chased him around trying to pin the tail on the donkey. And the joke was that the donkey was Cassirer. And, you know, so he's like, I'm Cassirer, you know, running around. They were all drunk and having fun. Levinas later said that this was one of his greatest regrets. He felt really bad. You know, this was, Cassirer was a Jew. Levinas was a Jew. Heidegger had a lot of Jewish students. And a few years later, when Heidegger became rector of Freiburg University, which required becoming a Nazi, Levinas was devastated. But it wasn't just, you know, wanting to be a rector of the university that made him become a Nazi. It was also that he was an actual conservative radical of the 1920s in Germany, which means that he was, if not fascist through and through, thinking about fascism like, this is an interesting approach. Maybe it's the solution to winning the next war, because we don't want to lose the next one, right? They knew it was coming and they didn't want to lose it, right? So I get into that in the Being and Time course. But Levinas was scandalized, to say the least. And then when World War II came, he enlisted to fight. He enlisted to fight the Nazis. Levinas joined the French resistance and was captured and put in a prisoner of war camp, POW camp. Because Levinas was an officer and because he was military, it meant it's okay. Like he wasn't gassed in a gas chamber, right? Like he still had to work, he had to do like slave labor, but the POW camp conditions were a lot better than the actual death camps. Paul Ricoeur, though maybe not in the same POW camp, was also in a POW camp at this time. Paul Ricoeur and Gadamer, these guys are famous hermeneuticists, right? After Heidegger, interpretation takes two directions. One is hermeneutics and the other is deconstruction. Levinas is kind of between these two, but he's also the Pope ethicist of deconstruction in a sense, because Derrida could see no foundation for ethics besides what Levinas comes up with. Ricoeur, talking to Simon Critchley, who was asking him about his time in the POW camp and what it was like, it was actually really great. It was amazing. People would send us books. We'd have book groups. We just got to read and talk about them, right? But I don't think Paul Ricoeur had to do the slave labor that Levinas had to do on account of his Jewishness. All right. Well, I mean, that's about as much biographical stuff I want to tell you about Levinas, except to say that he translated Husserl into French first, and he was thinking about these things at the same time as Sartre, and that in a lot of ways he prefigures a lot of the things that Sartre thinks about, and he also goes in a different direction. Though both of them are fundamentally interested in the concept of responsibility and freedom. But responsibility first, freedom second. Especially for Levinas. So on the side of Levinas here, I have the face, the saying, the other, and infinite obligation. And then at the bottom it says, excendence, question mark. Excendence is a neologism that Levinas apologizes for creating. He says, you'll have to pardon my neologism. He says this in On Escape. On Escape is the essay where he's thinking about this idea of exit. Exit and the outside. And if you're thinking about Nick Land when I say this, then good. I hope to leave time here for Mikey to say some things about the connection between Land and Levinas, which is crazy, guys. Nobody else talks about this. Nobody on the internet, nobody in academia. We're the first people in the world to make this connection. So, come on. Give it up to us. Give it up to us. We're fucking There's this weird connection. The fact is long before Nick Land was a zygote or whatever in his mama's womb, if he was ever actually born, he's probably one of those test tube babies from the 1970s, let's be honest. Long before that, Levinas was already thinking about beyond being and beyond meaning is this great outside. What he calls the anonymous rustling of the there is. The there is. I'll write it up on the board. There is. There is what? Well, there is something more than, something surplus to being and irreducible to being. And it, for Levinas, is what causes the baby to scream in the middle of the night. Right? I just wish that every parent in the world had at least an introductory understanding of Levinas. Right? I think there'd be a lot less parents shaking their babies in the middle of the night. Right? If they at least understood what it is that baby is confronting, which is not just the inability to put their anxieties into language, which is obviously part of it, but it's the actual terror of the infinite expanse of being itself and the burden that comes with existence. It's the fact that you're finding yourself assimilating into a prison. What are you doing here? You didn't choose this, right? You find yourself thrown into this situation. This essay called On Escape is what I'm going to want to focus on in this talk. For a couple of reasons. First, because the Totality and Infinity course is beginning this coming Saturday, which is August 3rd. And that's really exciting. But also because it helps us think about what we all essentially have in common. And it helps us think about Death Drive in a different way. Actually, in a way that he'll say is opposed to the common understanding of desire being based on lack. He says in On Escape that the idea of need, desire, and lack is that there's an insufficiency in being itself. That being is incomplete. And that desire is the desire to complete that insufficiency, to fill that insufficiency, to come to a sense of wholeness. He goes, no, guys, it's a lot more complicated than that. Actually, being is full already. Not only is being full, but you find yourself being And insofar as you are in being or of being or stuck to being, you're overwhelmed and you're suffocated and you want out. Being is suffocating. Being is like being in a room so full of, I don't know, pillows that you can't move. You're in the center of a room and you're squished in from all sides. There's no gaps. And you're just stuck to yourself is how he talks about it. He says that the self is riveted to itself. Riveted to itself. You can't get away from yourself. But pleasure comes along as the promise of satisfaction. Pleasure comes along as the promise of escape. Promise comes along and promise. Pleasure comes along and we go, oh yeah, I want that. That's a way to get outside of myself, right? But it's always a ruse. It's always disappointing. And what's worse is we find ourselves on the other side of the indulgence of pleasure, ashamed. And it's honestly the parts about shame in On Escape that I think are the most interesting. And he starts the book out, essay. Let me see if I can't find the actual quote here. It's so good. I just want to read it to you. Let's see. He starts it by critiquing the bourgeoisie, which is actually kind of crazy. He's talking about the bourgeois in this way that I didn't know he does that, right? Here, I found it. One second. Son of a bitch. No, I don't have it. What the hell? Where'd it go? Oh, here we go. Yeah, no, I actually have to read from this. I was going to have to just summarize it all, which would have been fine. But I want to let the author's actual voice, even though it's translated into English, come through a little bit. He said, the need to escape could not be confused with the life force or the creative evolution, which according to a famous description, he's referring to Bergson, in no way fixes its ends in advance, but creates them instead. That's also very Heideggerian, and he'll kind of make allusions to Heidegger as well whenever he talks about this. But the basic idea between Bergson and Heidegger is that we're that being who creates our own ends, who makes our own goals, who makes our own projects, right? For Heidegger, you're thrown into the world, and that means that you are always already, by the time you find yourself in this world, filling out or completing projects that you did not choose yourself, which is why not choosing is losing, right? Levinas wants to find something beyond choosing and losing in this sort of sense. But I'll go on. He says, does the created being not become real? Wait, what? This is the worst thing ever. What the hell? What a mess. Whatever. It doesn't matter. The main part that I want to read here is on page 50 of On Escape. He says, this conception of the I as self-sufficient is one of the essential marks of the bourgeois spirit and its philosophy. Self-sufficiency means not dependent on others, right? He says, as sufficiency for the petty bourgeois, this conception of the I nonetheless nourishes the audacious dreams of a restless and enterprising capitalism. This conception presides over capitalism's work ethic, its cult of initiative and discovery, which aims less at reconciling man with himself than at securing for him the unknowns of time and things. The bourgeois admits no inner division and would be ashamed to lack confidence in himself. But he is concerned about reality in the future, for they threaten to break up the uncontested equilibrium of the present where he holds sway. Which is to say, the status quo is serving the bourgeois individual. Insofar as you are successfully bourgeois, it means that you're in business, right? I don't want to use bourgeois in the sense of belonging to the ruling class. We're talking about the enterprise of the business owner. It's not just the 1%, right? It is the mentality of needing to secure a profitable situation for oneself in the moment. And your entire position, therefore, to the future becomes one of trying to control outcomes to keep things relatively the same as long as it can allow the number to go up. And it's interesting to hear Levinas do this because he doesn't talk about capitalism very much in most of his works. What did you say, Nance? Are you singing?
Nothing, man. No, so that bias to think that everything will remain the same, but the line goes up. Like that's very much the bourgeois, I guess, default mindset. That's also very common amongst tech bros today. And it just kind of like dawned on me that like, oh, AI is not a big problem. It's not going to end the world. Everything's going to stay the same for the most part. Just the number goes up a little bit.
Yeah. Swole told me the other day, AI is just part of the tech bubble. It's all going to pop. Nothing will change. And
Sure.
yeah, I was like, cool, man. This is what too much Marxism will do to a mofo, right? Like, you won't be able to see what's new, right? But I give him shit about this. We were arguing in public about that. And I took it a little too far. I said that he hasn't changed his position in 7 years. That's a lie. Okay, I was just dunking on him in public, which is kind of our attitude with one another. If you don't know Swole, he bullies people online. I bully him. He bullies me. We talk a lot of shit. He brings out the toxic male in me. It's true. But don't worry. It all goes on to him. He's like the scapegoat because he can take it. So, and he can take it because he's the man. Anyway. This conception presides over capitalism's work ethic, its cult of initiative and discovery, which aims less at reconciling man with himself than at securing for him the unknowns of time and things. The bourgeois admits no inner division and would be ashamed to lack confidence in himself, but he is concerned about reality in the future, for they threaten to break up the uncontested equilibrium of the present where he holds sway. Okay? Obviously, that's all being repeated, but I think that's important. He is essentially conservative, but there is a worried conservatism. The bourgeois is concerned with business matters and science as a defense against things and all that is unforeseeable in them. His instinct for possession is an instinct for integration, and his imperialism is a search for security. He would like to cast the white mantle of his internal peace over the antagonism that opposes him to the world. His lack of scruples is the shameful form of his tranquil conscience. Yet prosaically materialistic, he prefers the certainty of tomorrow to today's enjoyments. So yes, he's materialistic, but he can't even enjoy material things. Levinas will have a huge section in Totality and Infinity about the enjoyment we get from material things. He calls it living in the elemental. We live off of stuff. He says, for Heidegger, Dasein never enjoys soup. But what he's getting at is that, this is one of the most basic things about us, is the fact that we enjoy soup on a cold day. We enjoy the sun hitting our face, like when we are coming out, like, oh my gosh, oh wow, it's so nice outside. These little tiny things, maybe this is the micro dosing of jouissance that Mikey was talking about, but that is essential to this human experience that he's trying to get at. And it's essential to dwelling. It's It's essential to being self-sufficient, to finding yourself cut off from others, to being able to pull away from others, to be the ability to be separate in solitude is one of the fundamental things about us. And he wants to start there in Totality and Infinity. He starts there so that he can imminently critique it. But he doesn't imminently critique it just by saying, actually, you see, that self is composed of its reliance on and references to others, and which is the standard sort of dialectical approach. No, he's still not going to go for like, oh, we're all actually atomized. But the reason we're dependent on the other is because we need to escape. The self-sufficiency of the bourgeois who owns everything, but no, who owes nothing to anybody. That self-sufficiency, he says, is a delusion. I'll keep reading. He says, I'll repeat. Yes, prosaically materialistic, he prefers the certainty of tomorrow to today's enjoyments. He demands guarantees in the present against the future, which introduces unknowns into those solved problems from which he lives. What he possesses becomes capital, carrying interest or insurance against risks, and his future, thus tamed, is integrated in this way with his past. Yet this category of sufficiency is conceived in the image of being such as things offer it to us. They are. Their essence, their properties can be imperfect. The very fact of being is placed beyond the distinction between the perfect and the imperfect. The brutality of its assertion, that of the fact of being, is absolutely sufficient and refers to nothing else. Being is. There is nothing to add to this assertion as long as we envision in a being only its existence. This reference to oneself is precisely what one states when one speaks of the identity of being. Okay, and he goes on. But what matters for us is that he wants to say, look, the one thing that philosophy has been failing to understand is that our prime motive or the prime impulse is not the creative impulse of projection. It's not even just the line of flight that wants to re-territorialize somewhere else for D&G. There is going to be a really awesome possibility for bringing D&G and Levinas together here on Escape. Except that he's saying, and he argues this, I'm not going to unpack his arguments, I'm just going to tell you what he thinks. He does not think that this impulse for escape is so that you can relocate. He does not think that this impulse to escape is so that you can find something new. It's not so that you can go from one pleasurable thing to the next. These are all secondary. These are all distractions. This is all fetishization. The fundamental moment or experience is of realizing that you are full of yourself and you can't get out of yourself. That you're stuck with yourself. That you are riveted to being. And that death itself is not a promise of escape. Death itself can be a fantasy for escape. Right? Nietzsche talked about, the hardest nights can be withstood by, fantasizing about suicide. I'm paraphrasing, but that's what he said. Yeah, but that death does not come with the absolute promise of the end of being or a freedom from being. You could reincarnate. You could go to heaven or hell. You could find out that it was all a video game and now you're on the outside of the video game and now you're like, shit. So wait, am I still in a video game? And you don't know, right? Like there is this impossibility of getting to the bottom of being or of knowing where the actual outside will be. So this word excendence means an exit that is transcendent to being itself, an escape. But it's one that he thinks there might be a way to get there. We might, through various means, be able to brush up on this. but it's not going to be through the traditional avenues. It's definitely not going to be through what he calls positive religions. In fact, he would say that capitalism and positive religions are the two biggest things that get in the way of coming to terms with the fact that we are riveted to being. In fact, this is what he means by a positive religion. It's a religion that turns God into that which exists, or it turns God into the sort of bookend to being, the creator of creations. You know, God is uppercase B being, and everything else down from there is just like smaller kinds of being, orders of beings, right? He thinks that this is sort of like some wish fulfillment or something, right? But the ideology of completion, of fulfillment, is not on the basis of the fact that we lack and therefore we desire. According to him, that's all just to help us forget the fact that we are insufferably full of ourselves already. We fix onto, so I guess for him, he would think that the objet a, the object cause of our desires of various objects, is this impulse to get the fuck away from ourselves, right? And then the dissatisfaction that comes from the failures of that escape is what brings us to this state of shame. And I was reading this book. What was it called? Anne just read it as well. The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. Fucking crazy book by Louise Perry. I think it's very important. I have fundamental disagreements with her, but I also think she's saying things that nobody else will say that need to be said. And this idea that, what the fuck am I going to say about Louise Perry right now? I don't want to bring that up right now. Really, it's way too much for me to bring into this because I want to close this out sooner than later. So what I'll say about, bracket it, bookmark it. We are going to come back to it soon in the very near future. Yeah, no, don't worry about it. I don't want to have to go there. This being suffocated and thinking that freeing desire is going to bring you the solution is a fucking fool's errand that leads to insane burnout and disillusionment. Or in the case of, the sexual liberation or, the campus hookup, regret, oh, consent, it's all that matters. But then you're left in a state of regret afterwards, right? There are so many stupid Me Too's if you take up the standpoint of all that matters is consent, right? Stupid Me Too's would be like Louis C.K. or Ansari, whatever his name is, right? Where it's like, oh, I'm sorry, I got a blowjob, or I'm sorry, I asked permission if I could jack off in front of somebody, and then they felt weird about it later. But they said yes. Well, Louise Perry's point is just simply, consent isn't the be-all, end-all, guys. There's also basic human dignity towards one another. And if you sign away your right to being treated with dignity, that doesn't mean you're necessarily going to feel good about it later. Sometimes some of these norms come with reasons that are beyond our imagination or our ability to deduce based off of positive characteristics, traits, or properties or tendencies in the current situation, right? So maybe some baby got thrown out with the bathwater in the sexual revolution. That's what she's trying to get at. But how does this all relate to obligation and ideology? I want to close out by saying that for me, the way that I'm thinking about Levinas is kind of similar to how I was thinking about Hannah Arendt at the very beginning of this year. When I talked about, and I'll show it right here. I'm going to redraw it. Where's my eraser? The self that is split. Split between conscious and unconscious, right? But then for Arendt, there's also another split, and that's between me and myself. And that's a split that doesn't necessarily come into being unless you do have this Rumspringa. It's not a Rumspringa. It doesn't have to be a complete deep dive into philosophy. But it has to, it would probably involve journaling. It would probably involve plenty of time spent in solitude, pulling away from the social. That's not the same thing as staying isolated when you're already isolated because you're like an incel or something like that. No, we're talking about being a social person and then pulling away and then trying to reevaluate, like, can I live with myself if I keep living this way? That question, she says, creates this distance between me and myself. And myself is this thing that I've been calling a higher self. And I know that that's going to drive some people crazy because, I mean, Bourdieu would fucking go crazy just hearing me say that. Lots of people would want to deconstruct this idea of higher versus lower. It reifies all of these, hierarchies, right? But the moral question of how you live with yourself, if you keep on living this way, whether you live within a Nazi regime and you're going along with the status quo, or if you are on this career trajectory where you hustle and grind all of the time, all of your time is instrumentalized, and all you care about is profit and conquering the other or securing some kind of win in the future. That would be the pure egoism of the me in Levinas. And the higher self, which is not something that it seems like Levinas really gets into too much, not in the way that Arendt is talking about it, is the fact that you can choose to do otherwise than you've been doing. And I want to say that for Levinas, I think, and this will be one of the big things that we pay attention to over the next year, I think that he does have some kind of a conception of this higher self, but that it's actually in the face of the concrete other. So it's not in this moment of solitude when you ask yourself that question, but it's instead the question that is posed by the abject other, the destitute other, the indigent other, which is to say the orphan, the widow, the stranger. I think he would probably use the term refugee, except that stranger comes with a little bit more risk, a connotation of a little bit more risk, stranger danger. And I actually think he wants you to think the refugee might kill you. He doesn't want you to act like, no, strangers are all fucking great. We should be open-minded and bring them all in. He wants you to feel the call of responsibility that is there in the other, but also to realize it comes with danger. It's a danger that screams, don't kill me, right? On the one side, it says, help me. On the other side, you're saying, don't kill me. I want to help you, just don't kill me, Well, these limit cases of the orphan, the widow, the stranger are like the limit cases, they're analogous to these limit cases Mikey was talking about with Bataille and these extreme experiences where if all you focus on are the extremes, like, these CCRU kids back in the day, focusing on the extremes, then you forget that jouissance is something we're microdosing throughout our daily existence. But once you realize that, the death by 1,000 cuts is Disneyland, once you realize that, then you're able to see the microdosing of jouissance that we do on a daily basis. It's the same. That's the analogy here to Levinas's go-to limit case, or the cases of the orphan, the widow, the stranger. Every one of you is a concrete other. Every one of you is destitute. Every one of you is suffocated by being. Every one of you wants outside of yourself. Every one of you, every one of us, we all feel this, but also we get normalized and find ways of distracting ourselves and find ways of associating that covers all that up in the same way that we cover up how we microdose jouissance. and we look to these extremes, well, the extremes that we tend to look to, for Levinas at least, would be the orphan, the widow, and the stranger. I think nowadays, on the progressive side of things, it would be more like the intersectionally most marginalized person in a given situation, right? But the point is that it's a radical alterity, otherness, that allows us to kind of, on the one side, you can be deceived and think, oh, I'm normal. And that person, they're so far gone. Oh my God, that poor person, let me help them. But then like what Levinas wants is to shine a light on our own situation, which is also indigent, also impoverished, also destitute, also vulnerable, right? It is the fundamental vulnerability and precarity of the human being for Levinas that makes it so that the ego has to build walls of safety and security. And of course, the bourgeois individual goes so much further because that bourgeois individual doesn't owe anything to anybody. He says it's the bourgeois who is square with the other. To be square with the other is to say you have no debts with others, right? I've paid my dues. And that part of what the dollar does, and this is one of the things that David Graeber is so good at in his book on debt, is that the dollar gives us like the illusion of not owing anybody. Once you're not in debt, you've paid your dues, right? You're square with the other. This is the spirit of the bourgeois for Levinas. And it's a relief. And it's a defense mechanism, this relief, this being absolved of any debts to the other. It comes with, I think he says it's like a naive sort of, what's a word he used? It's a really good word. False serenity is the word he uses. It comes with a false serenity. Okay, so in the same way that and so the reason I brought Arendt in here alongside Levinas is whether our higher self is something that we come to know through encounters with radical alterity, or if it's something that we come by becoming other to ourselves in this space of solitude where we ask ourselves if we're able to keep living with ourselves the way that we've been going along with the flow with the society that we live in, whatever. I think from a standard critical theory position, this distinction is pure ideology because it's all just the big other anyway. It's all just the superego. It's all the symbolic order. Your sense of guilt, your sense of responsibility, your sense of morality itself is pure ideology. Levinas and Arendt, who are notably, survivors of the Holocaust, go, no, it's not all pure ideology. At bottom, there is a real responsibility. At bottom, there is a responsibility that is constitutive of ourselves and our ability to even be agents in the world, to have agency. Our ability to be free is based in this responsibility to the other. Sartre would agree 100% on this, right? What I want to say or propose, and I might have kind of already said it at the beginning of this year. I'm not exactly sure what I said because I haven't gone over the transcripts that Will is coming up with here, is that this distinction between me, as in my egoism, and myself as this virtual potential higher self is not reducible to what Freud would call the ego and the superego. It's not reducible to, plain little old you and the social agency of the symbolic order. Which means that the conscience that you feel when you feel like, oh, I shouldn't do that, that's not just a social construction. That construction is constructed on the site of your irreducible responsibility. And your irreducible responsibility is what's hijacked, co-opted by ideology. Whatever your big other is, whatever human groups you might be a part of, whatever social system those are all integrated into and are part of the in part reproduce, they wouldn't work if it wasn't for the fact that we are at bottom responsible and moral creatures. It's because we are moral creatures that we can have our moral sensibilities hijacked by ideology. Who knows? Maybe it's not true, but it's something I want to think about. It's something that I want to take seriously. And therefore, the point of deconstruction would be to take the constructions, the moral and ethical constructions that are built atop our actual potential to be a higher self, systematically break apart those presuppositions and see what's left. And Levinas is going to say, at the end of the day, what's left is that the other is irreducible to the things that they have said, is irreducible to the categories that we pigeonhole them into, is irreducible to the ways that they do or do not serve our interests as a bourgeois subjectivity, and that ultimately there's something there. It's something there that can't be totalized. It's infinite in its obligation, in its call of conscience, in the fact that it calls us to be something more. And so this question of like the self-same is another way he'll say the me or the egoism, self-same. The question of the self-sameness being a prison, high on the delusion of self-sufficiency. This experience of self-sufficiency and of self-sameness and of reducing everything else and everyone else into these little boxes so that we can integrate them into our worldview or just spit them out, right? Juxtapose them to our worldview. This is the basis of all brutality. And he would say it's the proper basis of barbarism itself. And that is why Levinas is for Derrida the ethical thinker of the 20th century and the inventor or the discoverer of the ethics of deconstruction itself. The point is not to spend our entire lives walking around going, I don't know anything. I can't say anything about anyone else. That's not the point. The point is to, as a sort of ethical practice, spend time living in the question, spend time breaking apart our assumptions about others, and ultimately to allow the other to speak. And instead of, in the moment, trying to instantly collapse what the other is saying into something that we already understand, just remaining open and listening and playing the believing game. It doesn't mean you have to stay there, but it means like this is a radical act. And it's a radical act that in some way lends us an opportunity to escape being. The last book that arguably the most important work by Levinas is called Otherwise Than Being. The first one is Totality and Infinity. Totality being itself, right? The sort of idea that we know everything we need to know because we know about beings, right? And that's everything we need to know about being itself. And he's saying, no, the infinity of the other, the infinity of the face of the other that goes beyond the physical appearance of the other, but it comes through in the voice, it comes through in the writing, it comes through in the spirit of the other. It's that saying that overflows everything that's already been said. It's that potential for something radically new. It's that potential to be constantly surprised. That's Totality and Infinity. That's the book that starts next week. Whereas Otherwise Than Being is kind of like the same lifelong project of his recapitulated to dodge all of the criticisms leveled against him by Derrida. Because Derrida says, I'm a Levinasian, but also, Levinas, you didn't get outside of the ontology that you thought you were getting outside of. Your very grammar revealed that you're still trapped inside of it. And Levinas was like, oh shit. So he spent 10 years reworking his project, and then he puts out Otherwise Than Being. But I just want you to think, when you hear otherwise than being, what is otherwise than being? It's escape. Thanks. Thanks, guys. Thank you. Thank you. And I'm going to relocate to the computer here. We'll talk to Mikey a little bit before he has to take off. And I've also, I'll take questions. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, good stuff. So the only thing I'll add in real quick is just that, I guess two things. I do think that, like you already know this, we've talked about it, but I do think there is this connection between Land and Levinas, and Dave talked about it as the rustling of the there is. The French term is il y a, which just means there is, right? But it's similar, I think, to what Land is getting at with the outside. Um, it's this domain of unknowable, threatening positivity, something like that. And yeah, we're usually blocked off from it, but I think the reason why the baby cries is, I think we're encountered with this. Like this, I'll speak from personal experience. I always sleep with a fan on. I'm somebody who always needs a fan going. If you want to kind of encounter it, you just find yourself in a pitch black room with silence. But what you find is that silence isn't silent. It has a sound to it, in a bizarre sense. There's a positivity to silence, and it's in that moment that you can kind of encounter this looming presence that you can't know or describe or whatever. But and it makes sense why he talks about it in terms of like the baby being alone in their crib, encountering this thing, so to speak. But the other thing I just want to say is, like, this idea of being stuck to our being. It seems like that would go against Lacan, because Lacan is always talking about lack, and we're chasing our being, which would be encapsulated by objet. But again, with Lacan, we always have to think these things on a Mobius strip, right? And the trick is, there's a sense where our desire is always in pursuit of objet, but with just the slightest bit of switch in perspective, in a parallax view, right? This goes all the way back to my original post on objet petit a. There's a sense in which objet petit a follows us, pursues us. We can't get rid of this virtual surplus that orients our whole lives. And I use the movie It Follows to describe this dynamic of objet in a sense pursuing us. It's this surplus, this almost it's objet almost as a monster, where it's like, could you just leave me the fuck alone, right? Stop orienting. I have to orient myself in everything I'm doing around you, because you won't leave me alone, right? And objet is that lost fragment or chunk of our being. We all know how it works. Socialization brought this sense of constitutive lack about. But like, on the one hand, we're always chasing it because we lack, but when we get too close to it, or when we think we're about to get what we've always desired, it's that's what provokes anxiety. So in seminar 10, on anxiety. If I can get to, there we go. Right. So there's a couple things here. One, yeah, it's not the lack of the object. It's not the lack of objet that causes us to have anxiety. It's when we feel an over proximate relationship to it. So see if I can find the key quote here real quick. I just had it and I lost it. One second. Wait, here we go. Okay, so this is on page 53. It goes over to 54. Lacan says, "Don't you know that it is not longing for the maternal breast that provokes anxiety, but its imminence? What provokes anxiety is everything that announces to us, that lets us glimpse that we're going to be taken back up into the lap, like our mother." And remember, the mother's just not your mom. It's das Ding. It's the over enigmatic presence of the other that is saturating you, which is to say, prior to symbolic castration, your connection to your mother is being. That's the fullness of being, right? Where nothing is lacking. So, and to back that up, so on 185, this is the other core dimension here. So if in Lacanian context we associate the mothers with das Ding, with the real, with an abundance of threatening, saturating presence, etc., right? Then this is why Lacan is justified when he says, so it goes that one says, for example, that the real is always full. That produces an effect. It's got a ring to it that lends credence to the thing, a little ring of tasteful Lacanianism. But who else but me can speak of the real like that? The rub is, I never said that. The real is teeming with hollows, and you can even create a vacuum in it. What I say is altogether different. It is that the real doesn't lack anything. So the trick is, what he's saying is he's as if like the real is this void, this empty place for Lacan. He's saying, no, it's actually like the opposite for me. It's the symbolic order with its mediation and the play of absence and difference that language brings into play that like institutes lack. Like the real in and of itself is pure positivity. It doesn't lack anything. Nothing's lacking in the real. The real becomes a void only when it's mediated, once it's looped together in the Bromian knot with the symbolic and the imaginary. But the real by itself, pure, unadulterated, suffocating presence, right? So now let's go back to the original quote where he says, okay, don't you know that it's not the longing for the maternal breast that provokes anxiety, but its imminence? What provokes anxiety is everything that announces to us, that lets us glimpse that we're going to be taken back onto the lap. It is not, contrary to what is said, the rhythm of the mother's alternating presence and absence. The proof of this is that the infant revels in repeating this game of presence and absence. There's the Fort Dog game. The kid, in a sense, kids love peekaboo, right? Kids love something disappears, it comes back, it disappears, it comes back. They love playing this game. This is not a traumatic thing for most kids, right? So he said, the security of presence is the possibility of absence. The most anguishing thing for the infant is precisely the moment when the relationship upon which he's established himself, of the lack that turns him into desire, is disrupted. And this relationship is most disrupted when there's no possibility of any lack, when the mother is on his back all the while, and especially when she's wiping his backside. This is one model of demand, and of demand that will never let up, right? So then he goes on and ties it to the superego. So you got the mom who won't get off the kid and is constantly suffocating the kid. And then that inability to let the kid individuate itself, to be caught up in the play of presence and absence. It's like this, she's demanding something of the kid. And so this is the super egoic toxic positivity of suffocating presence, right? So that's all I'll add to that. I just want to say, like, there is a sense where when OJR or which again is our last or our lost remainder chunk of being, right? Whenever that is too close, that's where being is pursuing us, and we can't get rid of it. And in a sense, it's a kind of horrifying thing that chases us, and we can't ever free ourselves from it.
Oh, really quick here before you go, Cesar. I just I unless you were going to ask me the question, how does all of this relate to underground theory writing? I'm going to go really quick because Rudy's not here, and Rudy would normally ask me about the thing that I forgot to bring in, which was usually the main point of the lecture. Like, Rudy's really good at that. So I'm just going to go ahead and just say, and I'm glad Mikey's still here because he'll probably have something to add to this, because we were both
I gotta
talking.
go.
No,
it's
but
after 2 though.
5 seconds. It's just right there on the whiteboard behind me. Academic theory versus underground theory. On the side of academic, you have machinic, and versus on the side of underground theory, you have human, and then the rest of it is like authority, solutions, and arguments versus singular questioning journey, institution versus milieu. Like I said, these are ideal types. They're not real, but it is the conversation I'm having with Mikey and the way that I am coming to see the world through him, and vice versa. And that way our own positions become more intelligible to us. Those kinds of contradictions that we're having, all of us, as this milieu forms, that is in this sort of process of discovery, as opposed to, look at me, I'm already the great academic, I've got it all figured out. That allows us to write in a different way, and it's something that people want. And so that's all. There you go, Mikey, you can go. Cool, Cesar, you can go.
All right. So I just started thinking of a kind of metaphor in my head that might relate what Mikey was talking about with these ideas of the order of things and chaos of things, and then how jouissance is kind of related to controlled chaos within order, and trying to relate this to an idea of Levinas, at least like what I'm starting to maybe pick up on what Levinas means by the other. And so basically how to like think of these two things of the chaos and the order of the other, and controlled chaos of seeing the other. And so far I've been thinking of ideas like maybe a ordered way of looking at the other would be am I back? Okay.
You back? Yeah, we heard
ordered
you.
way of thinking of the other would be very, very formal, like transactional interactions of talking to someone at a cash register, um, having like a customer to customer service relationship. Um, and then maybe chaos is like you're empathizing so much with the other that you lose yourself in the other. I think a lot of like horror and sci-fi especially like highlights uh you know potential examples of what this would look like, kind of dying upon yourself into another. um and then maybe this like controlled chaos without spilling over into full-blown chaos is confronting the other of maybe like the stranger, where there is nothing necessarily required of you to interact with the other, but it is almost like this like drive, this sense of like being confronted with something that's disrupting your pleasure, your normal like balanced kind of pleasure, and to actually uh, interact with the other in this sense is it is disruptive, but perhaps not in the way of always being disruptive to where like you're totally having to give over to every single other that you encounter. But maybe it's in some kind of controlled way that you can come back to order within it. So just what do you think about that, Dave?
Can you restate the question in like one sentence?
Yeah, it's not really a question, I guess, or I guess the question is this is my working idea
Yeah.
of how I'm kind of bridging what Mikey's lecture was, and uh, you're starting to you're starting discussion about the other,
Hmm.
and just how we could think of order and chaos with regard to the other.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I think that every that going along with the idea that what is constructed in ideology is constructed upon the site of an actually existing irreducible responsibility.
I just want to interrupt and say I think you need to switch mics. I think it's like getting the room mic from the podium.
How's this? Is this better? Yeah, okay. So the irreducible other and versus irreducible responsibility. I basically ideology that saying, when you name me, you negate me. Ideology, in a sort of sense, is a structure of naming that negates everything, everybody, right? The people who negate themselves to incorporate into that ideology, that's one thing. And then the others that it controls in some sense, it is like this controlled chaos, right? So one of the impulses of ideology is to control others. And so, I mean, we could definitely think of like, the major monotheistic religions as a great example of like when they are serving empire, like how they function to basically give people this ultimatum of like, hey, you know what? You can be a part of the universal. Join us. Of course, if you don't negate yourself by entering this thing, then we'll negate you, either actually during bloody times of, imperial war, literally, or just, symbolically by, for instance, not giving somebody the right to vote, not giving somebody the right to property or to certain kinds of careers or what have you, outsiders. Um, and so I don't know. This idea that what I really liked about Mikey's talk is that the other, sorry, what's the term here that I'm looking for? Chaos and order, he said, are not mutually exclusive as they are for Jordan Peterson, right? And I think for Levinas, the other part of like coming to terms with radical alterity, like what that means, is realizing that order is trying to control chaos, but that it wouldn't that it is reliant on that chaos, right? Like so, I do think that this is there. Levinas will never talk about it as chaos, but I mean the overwhelming burden of being that implodes identity at a certain level. The anonymous wrestling of the Ilia, the there is. It's kind of a. He also calls it like I think sometimes he refers to it as clashing. So it's wrestling, it's clashing, but it's just like this infinite, overwhelming, suffocating sense of being. That's chaos. But I also am worried that I am out on a limb here, trying too hard to draw a connection between these two things. And I think the main way that I would want to make the connection between the lectures, and I'm interested in everybody else's thoughts about this, but the main way I'm thinking about it is that the big other tries to stand in for the responsibility that we have to the concrete other. Instead of having a responsibility to the concrete other, we have a responsibility to our church, our school, our state, our country, our nation, right? So that's the main way I want to do it, is just to think there's this big other that's a Russian doll, but there's also the concrete other. And the concrete other is sort of this concrete, it is abstract, but we're calling it concrete. And so it's kind of contradictory to think about it in language, because it's supposed to sort of be the thing that language breaks apart upon. So language is supposed to, it's going to fail to try to actually understand the other. And the other is never one other. There's not just you and me, and there's not just orphans and widows and strangers, or one of each of these categories. No, there's millions of them, right? And there's billions of humans. And so, and that's one of Derrida's big critiques of totality infinity, is that like Levinas is mainly interested in the relation of the self to the other. And it is like this, he's trying to talk about the concrete other whenever he uppercases it, but also it is sort of this abstraction. And in reality, there's 8 billion concrete others, and then there's how many other billions of past others, and then billions of alternative others, because all those others are split. And then they're split by their conscious and unconscious, but they're also split by their ego and their potential higher selves. Like there's so many ways of splitting the other. So I mainly want to raise this as a problem, and just get us all thinking about uppercase O other for Lacan versus uppercase O other for Levinas being the symbolic order versus the actual human. The other actual human that usually gets negated by that symbolic order. Yeah. What's up, Ian?
Yeah, well, first, I'm excited for Levinas. I don't think he's very, quote unquote, like popular, right? On like at least on the internet scene.
No.
So it's always, yeah, it's refreshing to have a new like thinker. And then my question is, with the big other and the concrete other, if you could, because I do understand from what you just said that Levinas was actually thinking of the person in front of you, like literally like how the microphone is in front of you right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but I think, could you make the metaphor or the connection? Because to me, hearing Mikey and the with Todd seminar, the big other is very good at telling you what to do or what you should do. And this concrete other, like let's say like you are like a metaphorical like flesh, and that concrete other feels kind of like allows more for letting you choose what to do, right? And but it's not like you become the big other for that concrete other, but it's more like in a way this concrete other allows you to behave in certain ways that you may want to, that are in conversation with the concrete other, right? Then also, so yeah,
I would say it's kind of like the big other tells you what you should or shouldn't do, whereas a concrete other, the fact of its existence tells us that we should do, but it doesn't tell us what we should do. It's not prescriptive. If the actual concrete other says, "Hey, give me some ice cream," or "Give me $1 million," or whatever, it doesn't matter. Like that's that concrete other person giving some, what Heidegger would call ontic interpretation of what you should do. And maybe they're going to, put it through the frame of, or interpret it through the sort of common sense of the big other, you know, like the homeless person, help me, you know, give me $5 or whatever. I'm a vet. Well, that's one way of helping the other. And it's one way that that individual is going to go with, and that the big other ultimately supports in some way, usually, right? But for Levinas, he's not interested in what you should do for the other. He's interested in the fact that you can't get out of the sense that you are obligated to do something. And it's almost like everybody's in an arms race through marketing, through capitalism, through the state, through religion, to say, that responsibility you feel to the other, here is how to satisfy it. And Levinas is saying all ideology that tells you that you can satisfy it or that you can be square with the other is trying to cover up the fact that we're infinitely obligated as a way of life. That is just the fundamental fact of existence. It's a huge burden, and there are no easy solutions for it. And everybody who's coming along telling us this is the way that you'll be absolved, give that person $5. You know, go help at this soup kitchen. Sure, go do those things, but those don't absolve you. Those don't make you square with the other. And voting a certain way, being a part of a certain church, going to a certain protest, none of these things absolve you. And that sort of clean conscience of the bourgeois individual is exactly what he wants to go against. Yeah, I'll leave it at that for now. Well, you're going to say some more, though.
No, I think that's very interesting, and I see that playing in today's like reality every time. But I would use your term too, like not your term, but like that you use more the PMC. Yeah, with
Instead of
donations,
bourgeois.
right? Or like, yeah, like with donations or like save the ocean thing. It's almost like you're outsourcing that. What you said, like that debt to the other, or that not debt, but like compromise, right? So yeah.
I don't know that the PMC is inherently about self-sufficiency. I think that the bourgeois mentality is going to be something you find in the petty bourgeois and in the PMC, and really it'll be all across the middle class. But the way I understand the middle class is as being made up of primarily these two ideal types, which on the one side is the petty bourgeoisie and on the other side is the PMC. And both are going to have these ways in which they are bourgeois, but also both will have ways in which they're not bourgeois. And so the PMC the PMC is often not motivated by the profit motive, at least in an explicit way. The PMC has an occupation that is a dignified occupation that is not reducible to the profit motive, right? Like all of the vocations of the PMC are like these sort of noble pursuits that are supposedly living above the profit motive. Now, of course, they're not, but they have like this kind of prestige comes through symbolic capital, and it wouldn't work if it wasn't for the fact that they renounce the profit motive to some degree. Like the doctor says, yes, I make a lot of money, but that's not why I'm doing it.
Right.
And then the petty bourgeois person says, yes, I have to make money, but I am not a publicly traded corporation or a 501c3, and I'm not out to fuck over the local populace. In fact, I'm here to serve my neighborhood. Like so it's like the middle class is largely made up of those two kinds of approaches. And there are obviously in lots of families, both existing within, any given middle class family.
Yeah. And then another concept that I thought was really, really good of Levinas is the saying and the said. And yeah, I do think that then maybe books are a way of like getting into a cryo chamber and being like a weird zombie that you resuscitate when you're being read by other people. Because I feel like that's a way of, because I don't think all books are dead, no? Like I don't think the print is actually dead, or maybe they are like on a life but I do believe that they become fully alive when they're being read, right, and discussed, and they become the saying. So I
Right.
thought that that concept was very, very cool, like very nice from Levinas.
Yeah, he's definitely not anti-book. In fact, he thinks that God, insofar as there's God, is the limitlessness of interpretation. The fact that we can always requilt things. Like he thinks that, so it's just like a weird Judaic sort of almost mystical, though he doesn't like mysticism, he says. You know, he's not Martin Buber, you know. He's like, I'm not one of those guys. But he does take a really weird approach to where like what he thinks of as God has nothing to do with anything any American evangelical has in mind, because it's not this positive, like God doesn't have being, you know. God is not like the ground of being. It's like, no, God is just infinity, like the overflowing of the saying. And that's only something that we can experience through ourselves when we're talking to one another, right? And so it's like the, you know, great texts lend themselves to this sort of renewal through speech. Yeah, exactly. It's like you said, keeping it alive, you know. And then Nance, I'm curious what you're going to say about the machinic or whatever.
No, just like I think for me, like the concrete other is a little escape from like the rote fucking algorithmic behavior that we get trapped into due to our circumstances. I think it is interesting to think of like positivity, like uh being being as a positivity, and there being no room to like continue being like in this like overflowed room full of pillows. Like you're only free to be what you were in the past. Like there necessarily needs to be this negativity to open up the future. So freedom. And I don't know, I like that. I think like I in my notes I'm over here like someone needs to write Levinas for Tech Bros, because I think like the optimism that like contemporary business is nothing but just optimism. And like there are some alarmists and they're like doing the thing and oh the planet's on fire and oh algorithms and oh this and that, but like overwhelmingly it's just like no, everything's going to be all right. Like things will stay mostly the same and the numbers will continue to go up. And I don't know, it's interesting. And taking like the microdosing on the jouissance and also taking microdosing on the face of the other, like in a sense it can be it becomes ideology to just say Disneyland and the refugee and like only allowing those examples to be what they are. It's like no, we're having these encounters every day and we come up against these fetishes every day throughout our daily life, just in lesser degrees. So allowing it to not be the face of the refugee, but to be the face of your coworker. And to it's not Disneyland, it's me when I do the stupid thing. Like I think there's a lot of synergy between the two lectures today and like the meta conversation that's been going on in the background. And I also like, yeah, it definitely does justify underground theory. Like we're doing underground theory. We're making the human choice. So we're at least attempting to make the human choice to have this little escape from the machinic rote instructions of like, oh, I'm going to write this essay and it's going to be very formulaic and it's going to be this and that, but it's not going to say anything. It's going to bear no content. Like we are all here to worship this God of the infinitely saying, of the infinite saying. Like that's what we're all trying to do, and there's no room for that in the traditional outlets or whatever, and that's why underground theory matters.
And the machinic right?
Yeah.
Like the machinic says it makes it easy for people to see that all history is on a teleological journey to a singularity, because the instrumentalized mind is just being. It can't deal with negativity, and it can't deal with this. It's a reaction to the need to escape, but it can't cope with the inexhaustibility of that need, and it can't come to terms with that, right?
So it fills up all the space, and then you stay trapped. You stay trapped in not being as we think of being, but like being as what already has been. Like we want to be being as in what is not yet come into being, but the
like
being.
impossibility.
Yeah, we want the possibilities, but what we're stuck with is the already having actualized, which is fine.
Yeah, it's almost like
and
the future already happened, and we are just like going through it, no? Like,
Yeah, man.
and there is like that is a foreclosed in like now. Let us actually actualize our own future, no?
Yeah, that's
yeah, dude.
the publicly traded, Fortune 500 company, like world. Like the point is that none of those companies expect to be forever. All of them only care about their quarterly and annual profits. They're not thinking about 10 years out. They're not thinking about 20 years out. They're not thinking about 200 years. It's just like, it is really like this short-term mentality of growth.
But also in a way that like kind of perpetuates them forever. Like that mentality kind of like makes them apex predator to stay in business for 100 years, right?
Yeah.
They're going to stay in business until they destroy the fucking planet. And then from their point of view,
Exactly.
they
Yeah,
will,
like, well,
they
it
will
just happened.
infinitely persist because
if we're not here, then they infinitely persisted because, I mean.
Exactly,
yeah.
dude. No, I seriously think, I think Levinas has a lot to say about right now, as far as the way capital has kind of evolved. And I guess it's because he had a lot to say about it at the time, and just nothing got worse. And in fact, nothing got better, and everything in fact got worse. And I think that's why, but yeah, Levinas for tech bros.
Dude,
Definitely.
It's got to happen. With that, I'm going to close out this segment that is on the YouTube channel. To everybody who has watched this or listened to it on podcast, thank you so much for being along for the ride here. It's so cool of you to be here till the end. If you're interested in how to be a part of these backroom seminars, the ongoing research, the lectures, the discussions, the exegetical readings that we do, all of it, if you want to get more involved, or if you just want to become a patron, either way, go ahead and watch what I'm going to play right here. And thank you.
We cannot do direct revolution, but the only way to lay the foundation for it is to do what you are doing to move the underground. It's a theoretically correct title.
Welcome to Theory Underground, a place for workers with earbuds who are tired of letting others read and think on their behalf, slipstreaming our way into an understanding of the situation that short-circuits the deadlocks of our moment.
Research at Theory Underground focuses on what is most important for understanding our current situation: theory of the subject, capital, time-energy theory, critical media theory, CMT, and the most essential critiques necessary for understanding why the theory, ideology, and common sense of influencers left to right misses the mark.
Theory Underground is coming to a city near you. What that has meant in the last year is traveling across the United States, into Canada, and then all over Europe to promote our books, courses, and ideas related to time energy and underground theory. You've been reading Underground Theory.
I'm a publisher and an editor. I run and review books. Literally, it's my living. This is the best edited collection I've ever read.
Okay, picture this scene. America, early 2021. An Amazon warehouse worker arises from the emerging underground theory internet scene to create spaces for untimely topics and concerns that are too often neglected or kept in isolation today. Joined by a revolving cast of underground theorists, academics, and critics, he establishes what will become Theory Underground, a teaching, research, and publishing platform by and for working class intellectuals, autodidacts, and academics who want to do more than they're able to do within the confines of academia. That warehouse worker's name is David McKerracher, and his book Timenergy is his first major contribution to the world of theory. It was recently reprinted with a foreword by none other than Slavoj Žižek, who also contributed to Theory Underground's latest book.
My Bible, it's an excellent book.
A collection of essays called Underground Theory.
What you just heard is an excerpt from the Strange Exiles podcast, episode 23, where Bram from Strange Exiles interviewed me and Mikey. For those who don't know, Mikey is the author of the Dangerous Maybe blog. We are publishing one of his books here shortly at Theory Underground. He's also a lecturer at Theory Underground, and he's someone I've been friends and a collaborator with for over 10 years. But most importantly for you all, he's a fantastic lecturer, and it's a crime that he has to do wage labor right now. One of the long-term goals of Theory Underground has been now for a couple of years to hashtag free Mikey. That is something that I've been really pushing, but first I had to get freed from wage labor, which was achieved this year. That's right. Thanks to my monthly seminar subscribers, I was able to quit Amazon and do Theory Underground full time. Now I'm announcing the next big phase of the plan, which is the Mikey Down seminar. What monthly subscribers to the Mikey seminar are paying for is a survey of philosophy, including deep dives into Žižek, Land, Lacan, Baudrillard, Bataille, Lyotard, and ultimately the whole history of philosophy.
We're trying to build like this ongoing seminar, right? And that's what I really like about this thing, where, you know, if I'm teaching a main text, that's something I got to focus on. I got to really, but the seminar thing, we can do this stuff all the time, where we dive deeper into concepts, we dive deeper into certain, you know, sections of books or whatever, and we can really do this nuanced stuff.
I think that there's probably no better way for us to accelerate our learning in these areas than by slipstreaming Mikey. And that has been my belief for years and years and years now. It's official. You're able to help out. You're able to get involved. You're able to benefit directly from liberating him from wage labor. Get on it right now. Do it. Just go. Stop what you're doing. Go click the button, subscribe. This is what you do. Subscribe to him. If you're already signed up for the ongoing Theory Underground seminars, then that's the ones that I do with my wife, Anne. Though that's getting an upgrade, which means that I will be doing one session per month that is just me, and then I will also be doing the ones with Anne, which are a crash course in sociology, anthropology, the social sciences, and ultimately Marx, Heidegger, Levinas, Bourdieu, imminently critiquing pop psychology, sociology, self-help, and ultimately the doxa of our time. But if you would like to be a subscriber to both Mikey's seminar and the seminar that the Snellgrove McKerrachers are doing, then the best way is to become a Tier 4 subscriber, or you can be a Tier 2 subscriber to each of us. The reason this matters is because Tier 2 is like pretty much the best bang for your buck. It gives you huge discounts on all of the courses that we do. But if you can't afford it, Tier 4 is amazing because it gives you Tier 3 access at both Mikey's seminar and ours.
Finally, not everybody has time to be part of these ongoing research seminars, and they just want to fund the paid content for the YouTube and podcast. And so thank you so much to our patrons over at Patreon. They're the ones funding all the free stuff, so big thank you to Bert, Marilyn, Carl, Sahil, Zozandra, Nikolai, Darian, Tyler, and Mandeep, and all the other wonderful patron people. Patreon people. And thank you to all the other wonderful Patreon people. Thank you so much to all of you patrons, and also to the special subscribers and the paying subscribers. Oh my god! It's just so awkward. Thank you, Patreon. Patrons. Thank you, okay. And to all the other wonderful patrons. Thank you so much, all you patrons. And also a special thanks to the subscribers on the YouTube side, as well as the paying subscribers over at Substack. Why can't we do this? fucked. You guys,
Please.
just thank you. Thank you, everyone, for making this bullshit possible. Thank you to the subscribe. You did so good. Thanks, guys.